see you speak. What is it that you think that people are hungry for? They want to hear from you.
They're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges and freedom and impulsive pleasure, and those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good, because if people are moored shallowly, then storms wreck them, and storms come along. So I'm talking to people about how they can build a foundation underneath them that works, and people need to know that, because otherwise their lives are harder than they need to be.
What is it that you have that no one else has? What are you offering that no one else is right now?
Well, I think that is what I'm offering. That's not part of the public discussion, and it's grounded in my clinical knowledge. So I've been a clinician for a very long time, and I'm familiar with the works of most of the great 20th century clinicians, and a reasonable amount of philosophy, and a good swath of literature, and I'm a credible scientist, and so I can bring that all together. And I've tried to bring it all together and to make a case for the significance of individual life and the psychological necessity of courage and nobility and responsibility, these things that sound old-fashioned, but are old-fashioned in the best sense. They're old-fashioned because they've lasted forever and they're absolutely necessary. And people need a call to responsibility because they need to mature. They need to want to be adults. And I don't think we do a very good job in our culture of making a case for why it's a good thing to be an adult.
And two things really made you famous, which is, first of all, is the book, 12 Rules for Life. Mm-hmm. The second one, I think, was an interview that went viral with Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News, which she talked about men and women.
Podcasts help plenty too.
Right, he's got a big, big following. But that was, I think, really fascinating, that interview, because it was specifically about men and women. And you said at the time, YouTube skews very male and your fan base is very male. Is that still the case? Are you still primarily talking to men?
I would say the talks are probably 60-40, 65-35 male to female. The book sales, I don't know. I doubt it, because usually it's women who buy books, although men do buy nonfiction if they buy books. We don't know the demographics on the books.
No, but thanks anyway.
Expanded my
Wonderboy
audience, I would say. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I never set out specifically to talk to men. My students for most years at university have been primarily female. I think most of my graduate students have been female.
People that come along and
but I think it would probably tilt more in the
ask if you want to become famous, so like please join this website or pay this money, and for only this much, we can make you famous on Twitch. I'm like, no, actually, I just want to play video games. That's all I want to do.
It might also be something to do with...
and since I'm playing games kind of anyway, I'm just recording it.
I'm not exactly sure why that would be more necessary.
I've been wanting to play these old Sega games for ages.
Because our culture confuses men's desire for achievement and competence with the patriarchal desire for tyrannical power. And that's a big mistake. Those aren't the same thing, even a bit. So, and it's very inappropriate psychologically and sociologically to confuse them. So,
well, one of the things I want to come back to is this idea. So that you say in the book, there is masculine order and feminine chaos.
No, actually, I say that those are symbolic representations of the two things.
Right. Okay. So why is order masculine?
I think it's because our primary social hierarchy structures are fundamentally masculine.
And that's not the patriarchy.
Well, it's not the modern idea of the patriarchy, that's for sure.
I mean, that's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
A very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper successful men, and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
But I could say equally well that most rape victims are women. Terrible things happen to people of both sexes.
And you could say that with perfect utility, but that doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of a male-dominated patriarchy.
Well,
it just means that terrible things happen to both genders, which they certainly do.
But there are almost no women who rape men, for example. So that is an asymmetry there in sexual violence.
Well, yes, there's an asymmetry in all sorts of places.
Many female teachers have been getting busted lately, like in the last 5 years, getting with their 12, 13-year-old students. Quite a few, actually. There's plenty of female rapists. They just they do it different ways.
Even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice. And it's the case with almost every interaction that you have at the face of our culture. You're dealing with people who are offering a service of one form or another, who are usually part of the broad middle class, and who offer, and what you're looking for is the person who can offer the best service, and you can find it. It's not a consequence of being dominated by anything that's tyrannical. And then again, our culture, our Western culture, which is by no means perfect, and certainly has tyrannical elements, like all cultures do, is the least tyrannical society that's ever been produced, and certainly the least tyrannical society that exists now. So where's the patriarchy exactly in all of this?
Well, saying that it's the least tyrannical society is not the same as saying it's not a tyrannical society.
That's exactly why I said it was the least tyrannical
But that's
society.
what I mean. So you haven't debunked the existence of patriarchy then. You've said that actually now is better for women.
I don't have to debunk it. You have to demonstrate its existence.
Okay, well, let's go through it. I'm writing a book about feminism in the moment. Until 1919, there were professions that women were barred from. They simply were not allowed to do it. Until 1880s...
Why would you blame men for that?
Because who was in those professions, who was guarding entry to those professions, who was worried about losing their status if women became doctors?
What do you think it was that emancipated women in the 20th century, just out of curiosity?
Well, a couple of different things. I think it was technology. I think it was the pill helped enormously because it gave
when was that developed?
Well, in the 60s.
Right, so that wasn't 1919.
No, but I also think it was a series of legal changes that started in Britain with the Married Women's Property Act, which said for the first time women are full legal beings under the law. They can own property. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is a structure that has continued throughout, from a time when women didn't have the same legal rights as men to now when they mostly do, but culture still lags behind it. I don't think you and I are necessarily talking at such cross purposes. It's just that your conception of patriarchy, as I see it in the book, is that quite a lot of men are quite nice and they do nice things for women. And
no, that's not my conception of patriarchy. And I don't require men or advise them to be nice, ever.
Well, you do talk about the guy who's the tampon king, the sanitary towel king of India, right?
I wouldn't call that nice.
Okay,
I would call that brave.
Okay.
Did you read about his life when he was trying to develop that?
Yeah.
God, it was absolutely miserable, and he did it anyways. He freed all sorts of women as a consequence.
And I think that was
nice. That's courageous. That's noble. That's visionary. It's not nice.
I think it is also nice. I think it is also something that is, it is honouring your social obligations.
I'm not so sure that that's a social obligation, because many other people would have done it had it been a social obligation. He said what he was concerned about. He saw that his wife was suffering with her monthly period and had to choose between feeding her family and taking care of herself properly, and chose to feed her family and thought he would do something about that. That goes way past nice, especially given what he had to suffer through to do all the experimentation that produced his eventual technology. So, this whole patriarchy thing, I think you have no idea how pernicious and dangerous it is.
Well, no, I don't. I really don't. Go.
Throughout history, have fundamentally cooperated to push back against the absolute catastrophe of existence. A terrible death rate, the probability of chronic starvation, early death, disease, the difficulty of raising children, with all the death that was associated with that. And to look backwards in time and say, well, basically what happened was men took the upper hand and persecuted women in this tyrannical patriarchy. It's absolutely dreadful misreading of history. It's a terrible thing to teach young women, and it's a horrible thing to inflict upon men.
I mean, I absolutely disagree with you. I think that's like saying slavery in the US was actually most people cooperated. Well, no, you didn't. You had a system where one set of people owned another set of people. And until women got full legal rights, they could own property for themselves, they could work. Essentially, they were owned. They were first owned by their fathers and then by their husbands.
Status to the domination by men.
Yeah.
You already said that you thought that what emancipated women primarily in the 20th century was technological revolution.
No, not primarily, but that's one of two. I think that's two things.
Not primarily, eh?
No,
you don't think the pill was a primary force in the emancipation of women?
I think
or the invention of tampons, let's say, or the provision of proper sanitary facilities, toilets, and that sort of thing. You're thinking instead it was the action of courageous feminists in the 1920s that produced a social revolution that overthrew the patriarchy. That's your theory.
Yeah, I think
that's a foolish theory.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear you say that, but I think, to quote you in the Cathy Newman interview, I think it's a multivariate, right? I think there are lots of different things that all contributed to women gaining full rights.
Well, then let's not be assuming that Western society was a tyrannical patriarchy.
Well, no, but that's one of them, and
assumption.
Then other things happened as well. So you have the pill, you have the dishwasher and white goods, labour-saving devices in the home. I think all of those were really important. But you also have things like campaigns for the vote.
Yes, you also have things like that, yes.
So how, when in a system that existed in England until 1918, when
why would you even want to look at history like that? Like, what's your goal?
Because exactly. I think the people who don't look at history are condemned to repeat it, and I think that what
are we going to do? Repeat the persecution of women? Do you think that's a realistic possibility?
Yeah, we're sitting here.
How do you see that?
We're sitting here in America, right, where we've just had a 5th judge appointed to the Supreme Court who is now anti-abortion, who's now conservative. I think that abortion rights are absolutely fundamental to women being able to function as full humans in society, and I think that.
I'm not left or right, but interestingly, Donald Trump actually appointed a female into the Supreme Court. Well, not a male at all, and he's on the right.
It's a living.
Some people are just so full of shit.
There are lots of people who agree with me. There are lots of people clearly who agree with you.
There are just a lot of people, I would say, who are coming to listen to what I say because they're sick and tired of having their desire to move forward in the world and to achieve something and to take their place as adult males, let's say, who are under the weight of accusations that their ambition and forthrightness is a manifestation of something that's fundamentally tyrannical. They're not happy with that. It's not doing anyone any good, and it's also not true. It's really a terrible thing to do to young men, and it's happening all the time. That's why they're bailing out of universities like mad. There won't be a man left in the social sciences in 10 years in the universities, and it's no bloody wonder. It's an unhospitable place, and it's unhospitable precisely because of this doctrine. Said that throughout history, the fundamental relationship between men and women was one of power, essentially slavery. It's like, fine, believe it if you want. It's not going to do your relationships any good, I can tell you that. So.
Okay, well, we'll see how that one goes. I'm currently married, but I'll raise it with him. I think the university's example is a really fascinating one because you talk in the book about the fact that now women are a majority on 2/3 of college courses in the US. And I've also seen you saying, well, you believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. Maybe women.
It isn't only that I don't believe in equality of outcome. I think it's an unbelievably pathological wish and doctrine.
Right,
and it's very dangerous. History has demonstrated exactly how dangerous it is. Equality of opportunity is something that anyone with any sense would support, but equality of outcome, it's.
So what's your problem with there not being
beyond belief to support equality of outcome?
Okay, so what's your problem with there not being enough men in the social sciences? Perhaps women are just cleverer. Perhaps that's why there are more women at university, right? Under your doctrine, I don't think that, but that's
I think
the logical extension of your doctrine.
It isn't the fact that there's an unequal distribution. The problem I have with it is that the reason that men are bailing out is because of the prevalence of the doctrine that you're espousing. That's the problem I have with it. It doesn't matter that much. They will bail out. I don't see any way that the universities are going to redeem themselves in the next decade. So, and maybe that will be fine. But I doubt it. We'll see.
That seems extremely pessimistic when the numbers of people going to university just generally are going up.
Yeah, well, that's not going to last for very long.
Why not?
Because it's too expensive and the universities are doing all sorts of things that aren't acceptable. Mostly ratcheting up the price. So, and decreasing the quality of what they're offering and playing into the hands of the people who are ideological acolytes of the identity politics routines and playing postmodern stunts and pushing neo-Marxism and all these things that are characteristic of the social sciences and the humanities primarily.
See, this is where I find you fascinating to me because, you talk in these quite apocalyptic terms. I think that, someone will listen to that and think, wow, there's a really big problem. But what we're really talking about is some irritatingly postmodern professors and some students with blue hair and funny ideas about gender in a handful of courses around America and Western Europe.
If that's what we were talking about, no one would have paid attention to me for more than about 15 minutes. So you might see this as some surface manifestation that's irrelevant, but that isn't how most people view it. It's certainly the case, too, that this identity politics battle of ideas was a determining factor in the last American election. If Hillary wouldn't have played identity politics, played cozy with the identity politics type, she would have kept the working class and she would be president now. So these aren't trivial issues by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just some kids having a decent time while they're being creatively rebellious at university. It's a much deeper problem than that. The doctrines that I'm opposed to are predicated on, well, one assumption they're predicated on, it's probably the primary assumption, is that the best way to view history is as the domination of a tyrannical male patriarchy, and that's true also particularly of the West, which is a doctrine I find absolutely unpalatable and historically absurd, biologically ridiculous, and ungrateful, among other things.
Who's ungrateful, sorry, in that? Who is being ungrateful?
Look at what you have.
Right.
You live in the best society that's ever been created. You know, I was reading about some Indonesians.
Do you mean me as a woman or me as a 21st century person in the world?
I mean us, yeah.
I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for what I have, but to me the project of politics is...
construction of a tyrannical patriarchy. You're grateful for the productions of a tyrannical patriarchy. How does that make sense?
Because I think life is good. I think it could be better. That's what being
fine.
a progressive
That's a perfectly
means.
reasonable proposition.
But I guess
that isn't commensurate with your claim that you're the beneficiary of a tyrannical patriarchy.
Why not?
How can it be good if it's the consequence of a tyrannical patriarchy? Tyranny isn't good, is it? I mean, that's the definition of tyranny. Something that isn't good, and yet it's produced all these things that you're grateful for. Like, doesn't that contradiction bother you? Where did what was good come from?
I think I'm benefiting actually from a lot of things that I don't support, that are unearned privileges in my life. I think that's absolutely true.
Like your job?
Like I have a very good job. I had a loving family. Well, I don't think that's going to do the world any good, is it?
That's a hell of a fine rationalization for your privileged position.
Thinks of her father.
But
she says that he comes from like a loving family.
I could do that, and
she's giving all males crap,
and I won't, and I don't think I should be expected to.
Why not? Is it okay?
She's just said that she comes from a loving family.
Privilege in the patriarchal tyranny, and if it is it because you're female, or is it just because it's convenient?
Let me tell you my political philosophy. I guess I'm a social democrat. So what I believe is that you should, if you have a good life, you should try and pass that on. I believe in a progressive redistributive tax system, for example. It was once said by Lord Mandelson in British politics, New Labour was okay with people being filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Now, I'm kind of less okay with people being filthy rich. But
Define filthy rich.
Well, I think I would leave that
You're probably in the top 1/10 of 1% of people who've ever lived on the planet. That would constitute filthy rich by historical standards.
Okay, but I'm not sure that I'm going
the line exactly?
Be able to help the Neanderthals at this point, really, by giving up some money. But this is my point, is that what I believe is, I believe in a structure in which people who have had a good life and had lots of advantages should pay that back, pay that forwards, which I think is the message that you preach as well, right? You have responsibilities. And if you've had, like us, a lot of advantages in life.
Civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy.
But it's not purely a tyrannical patriarchy,
That's for sure.
Is it?
It's purely not.
Right.
And that's exactly the issue.
But why
because
would you
when you
deal with moral
describe it as a
absolutes
tyrannical patriarchy, then you make a case that it's purely that. And that's exactly what's ungrateful. It's not purely that at all.
Why is saying that something has elements of this mean the same as it is purely that?
That isn't what's being said. Merely to define it as a patriarchy implies unidimensionality. And to insist that that's also tyrannical doesn't offer a balanced viewpoint at all.
Well, I think that's probably where your disagreement comes with this, which is because I do not see it in that way. I do not see that as univariate at all. I see it as one element of many.
Then why call it a patriarchy?
Because it describes an overarching structure.
Does it?
Yeah.
And what if the patriarchy is fundamentally composed of women? Is it still a patriarchy?
No, that would be a matriarchy.
Would it? So let's say we take a patriarchal structure, like the medical profession, and we fill it primarily with women. Is it then a matriarchal structure? What makes it a patriarchy to begin with? Is it the hierarchical structure? Is it the fact that it's mostly men? Is it the sociological structure? Or is it the fact that it's mostly men?
Well, I think that's really interesting because male primary school teachers, for example, only 15% of them are men. And I interviewed some of them for my book. And you know what? They report exactly the same things that women do in male-dominated offices, right? They say, people have conversations that I feel excluded from. I feel stigmatised, like I shouldn't be here. People look at me askance when I say I'm a primary school teacher and I'm a man. You know, they kind of reel back. We all make those implicit associations.
So if it is a structure that's dominated by women, then it's also a tyrannical patriarchy.
I think in that case, then men have a way of, they should be able to complain about the fact that a very female-dominated office leaves them feeling out too. Yeah, feeling left out too.
So how do we get something that isn't a tyrannical patriarchy? If it's composed of women, then it's a tyrannical patriarchy, and if it's composed of men, it's a tyrannical patriarchy. We're kind of out of options.
Right, but, well, or you could have an office in which a blend of people of both sexes work.
So if it's 50-50, then it's not a tyrannical patriarchy.
No, not 50-50. I'm saying that people...
40-60.
I'm saying that there is clearly, when it is only 15% of male primary school teachers, they do feel marginalised and excluded. So
you think the defining hallmark of a tyrannical social structure is the predominance of one gender, and if that was relatively equalised, then all of a sudden it would be a free and open institution.
I don't think that male primary school teachers are being tyrannised. I do think they are being marginalised, and I do think that they feel excluded and stressed by that.
So what do you do about that?
Well, this is what I mean. I think, actually, and I'm surprised you don't agree with me on this, that actually having more male primary school teachers would be a really good thing, because boys need role models, actually, particularly boys who don't have a father figure in their life. That's really important for them, to have a stable adult who shows them what it's like to be a man around the place.
Could be, but you shouldn't achieve it as a consequence of preferential hiring.
No, I don't think it would necessarily need to be preferential hiring. I think it would probably be about making that job, breaking down the stigma to entering that job. I think teaching is a really interesting example. It was seen at the turn of...
I worked in daycares when I was 18, 19.
Right.
You know, there were no men in it.
And how did that make you feel?
I loved it.
Yeah.
You know, the kids... I used to wrestle with the kids, which of course can't do now because everybody knows that would just be a catastrophe. And I used to draw them pictures of monsters and they'd line up for that. And I liked working with kids quite a lot. And I didn't care whether it was female-dominated. I've been in female-dominated my professions my whole life.
Right, I think... I
haven't felt marginalised as a consequence.
Well, then you have been lucky, and I have talked to people who have
might be luck.
The opposite.
Might be careful conduct as well.
Explain that more to me.
Well, why would you assume that it would be luck?
Well, if I say that, you know, there is a statistical analysis, and I've talked to a broad range of people, and, you know, you would always expect outliers at either end. Some people have had a really terrible time, some people have had a really brilliant time, everybody else in the middle.
One of the things that I've strived to do is not to become resentful.
Well, okay, that's very good. I have to say that your Twitter feed does not give me that impression. You come across as somebody who takes criticism very much to heart. Is that true?
I don't think you have any grounds for that suggestion. I mean, you've seen my interviews online. If I was someone who took criticism at heart, I'd be in a lot more trouble than I am now.
In what way?
Well, I've been criticised endlessly for 2 years. I've been in scandals. I've probably been in, I don't know how many scandals in the last 2 years, and had unbelievably contentious interviews with journalists online, on TV, on radio, in podcasts. If I was someone who couldn't tolerate criticism, the evidence for that would already be clear. Twitter is a strange social network. I've kind of pulled myself away from it. So it's not an easy place to conduct yourself with as much grace as you might. And I think it sort of rewards impulsivity because maybe it's because of the constraint on characters or something like that. So I think that people tend to show their worst on Twitter, and some of that's a consequence of the structure of the technology.
I think I certainly agree with you. I think that's something that we agree on there. I think people are rarely at their best on Twitter.
No, and you know, I've pulled myself away from it quite a lot in the last month, mostly to see why. You know, I kind of kept an eye on Twitter, all the social media networks for the last few years, partly to see, well, I'm trying to monitor what's happening around me, I suppose, is probably the right way of thinking about it, and to see if I'm making mistakes and how they might be rectified. But I don't think Twitter's been good for me, and I don't think the reply function on Twitter is useful, and I think the fact that so many people on Twitter are anonymous is not a good thing at all.
Do you think you'd be less angry if you went on Twitter? That's something I think quite a lot. I would be come into contact with less things that annoyed me on a daily basis.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah. I think that's definitely the case. And I've talked to other people who've pulled back from Twitter and experienced the same thing. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something about Twitter that seems to really heighten the desire of people to be provocative. And maybe it's the case that only people who are feeling irritable respond. We don't know, like if you put up a post and 1,000 people read it, certainly 1,000 people don't respond. A few people respond. Well, maybe it skews way over to those people who had a bad day. Like, we have no idea, right? Because it's a communication channel that no one understands. We're not evolved to understand it. We're not evolved to use it. We can't interpret it. Plus, you're interacting with random strangers, which is something you never, ever do. And it's never the same set of random strangers. And you don't react to Twitter like it's random strangers. You react to Twitter like it's a person that you know. And it isn't.
You write in 12 Rules for Life about having had violent impulses that you didn't act on, and I think in Maps of Meaning you sort of elaborate on that. You say you fantasize about stabbing a classmate in the neck, and you say you're very clear about the fact that you've never ever thought that you would take those seriously. But it just does make me think whether or not are you somebody who thrives on anger, who finds anger to be something that they need in their life, that they find motivates them to do the things that they need to do.
Those are two different questions.
Okay, you can answer them both.
One is whether I thrive on it, and the answer to that is most certainly not. So I actually don't like conflict.
Then how have you ended up doing this as a job, which is arguing with people, right?
Just because no, that's not my job. It's not to argue with people.
Okay.
So my job is to not do things that I don't think I should do. Right, and my government made the mistake of assuming that compelled speech was acceptable as long as it was motivated by hypothetical compassion. And that's not happened for me. So I made that point. It wasn't because I wanted to or because I enjoyed it. I don't really like conflict. I'm actually a rather agreeable person, which is partly why I'm a clinician. And so I find the constant conflict exhausting. But that's not the issue. You're not morally obligated. You're morally obligated to do things other than that which you like. So now I really do enjoy the lecture series that I'm doing. And the reason for that is that it's not political in its essence. I'm trying to do everything I can to bring people who are trying to develop a vision for their life together and to encourage them to act more responsibly, but not in a finger-wagging sort of way, but because I've come to understand that the meaning that sustains you in life is mostly to be found through responsibility. And through the voluntary adoption of responsibility, you're very likely to find your fundamental strength. And I think that that's clinically unassailable observation. And that's all very good, and I'm very pleased to be doing it. And it seems to be having a salutary effect, as far as I can tell. And but it's not because I thrive on anger. I mean, you were at my show,
on Thursday night, yeah.
How much anger was there in that?
Well, I thought it was fascinating because it was in Long Island. We drove to it and we went past a Lamborghini dealership, a Porsche dealership. This is not a poor area.
Go down there.
The audience was, I would say, very...
I've got to figure out how to get to this point without losing health.
Overwhelmingly white. And I thought you talked... you said at the end, I was more incoherent than I normally am. You ranged across quite a range of subjects from, status in monkeys to perception. But the things that the crowd clapped and they applauded where you went, oh, you can't say that, that's a microaggression. Or multiculturalism is a scourge that is sweeping Canada. And what I got was a strong sense...
No, that has swept Canada.
Okay. Well, what I got was a very strong sense of people whose lives...
I never said that it was a scourge that swept Canada either. I wouldn't have said that.
Okay, well, I will go back and check your exact wording of what you said, but you definitely...
I'm not in favour of it as a fundamental doctrine.
Right, okay.
But I don't think it's a scourge.
So I wonder if you and I mean the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism, because you have a First Nations room in your house, right? You have a lot of First Nations stuff. How is the coexistence
I'm the honorary member of a First Nations family, as a matter of fact.
Which is wonderful. I have a First Nations artist when I went to Canada last year. But that, to me, is the essence of Canadian multiculturalism, that culture being preserved and living alongside the Anglophone culture that, in some senses, supplanted it. How is that not multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. That's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world, and the world is full of war. So how can that possibly work? If you're going to bring people together and they're going to exist together in harmony, they have to be playing a game that everyone plays, that everyone knows the rules for. It can't be 10 different sets of rules for different people. That isn't going to work. So it's absolutely naive to believe. How?
It's like the dragon kill everybody.
If that worked, the world wouldn't be full of war.
Well, before we had, multiculturalism, we still did have war. In fact, war is, as Steven Pinker, I'm sure you read what Steven Pinker says, this is the least violent time in human history. So something
that's a consequence of
working.
The patriarchal tyranny.
Well, if you think that the patriarchy's been eroded over the last 100 years, maybe that's what it's down to. Maybe you could give some credit to it for that.
I actually didn't say that the patriarchy had been eroded.
Well, because you don't believe it exists in the first place. Fair enough. But my definition of multiculturalism is citizenship-based, right? So you can be both Canadian and First Nations. You can be both Quebecois and also Canadian.
But that means that everybody in the multicultural milieu is one thing and another.
Right.
But they're all one thing and another.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, our Prime Minister said, well, there is no Canadian identity. It's like, well, okay, what is it that unites us? Well, nothing. We all protect our cultures. It's like, well, that leads to war.
Okay,
it doesn't only lead to war, obviously, but unless you have people operating within a shared framework of perception and value, they can't cooperate and compete peacefully. I don't understand how that's even a disputable topic. That's how you organize people.
Okay, I think if that's what he said, that's what Trudeau said, that is a dumb thing for the Prime Minister of Canada to say when you are Prime Minister of Canada.
You might say that.
Would agree much more with what Barack Obama said when he said, I'm trying not to make a red states America or blue states America or white America, black America. I'm trying to make a United States America. That to me is...
Yes, the Democrats are very good at that.
Well, they
played identity politics for the last 20 years. All they've done is inflame tribal tendencies, as far as I can tell. So he can say that, but it isn't obvious that it's the case. And it's not obvious to me at all that one of the consequences of Barack Obama's presidency was a reduction in racial tension in the United States.
No, I wouldn't agree with that either. I think a lot of people found having a black college-educated professor very alarming and threatening to their idea of themselves as the dominant group.
To stop them from voting for him twice.
No, that is very true. But again,
it's fundamentally true, right? It's really the crucial issue at hand here.
No, but he built a big coalition of white, well-educated liberals and people of colour. I mean, that is the Democrat electoral.
Well, how do you explain the rise of racial tension in the United States then?
Well, I think it's caused by a lot of things, not least of one of which is the Republican Party inflaming it. You talk about the left playing identity politics. I think the right play identity politics all the time.
The right doesn't dominate the universities.
No, but it dominates. But Donald Trump is president, so realistically,
Donald Trump is hardly a typical Republican.
No, I would say that he accomplished...
In fact, for most of his life, if I remember correctly, he was a Democrat.
Right, I don't think he has any political...
So we're not going to blame Donald Trump on the right wing.
Okay, but I'm going to say the rest of the Republican Party are also quite happy to play, I would say, white identity politics. They did not dump him as their candidate when he said, Mexicans, they're not sending us their best people here, they're rapists, right? The whole idea of the United States, it said, I think a beautiful thing, all men are created equal, but it meant men, and it meant specifically white men. Women and black people could not vote. The US was founded on identity politics. This is not some new concept that has come along in the last 20 years.
The United States wasn't founded on identity politics.
Yes, it was.
That's absolutely absurd proposition. The United States was founded on the same principles that, what would you say, that played their powerful role through the development of English democracy, and that was nested inside a Judeo-Christian view that fundamentally presumed that both men and women were made in the image of God and that all people had divine value. And it took a long time for that set of ideas to fully manifest itself in the political realm. But to consider that a manifestation of identity politics is... I can't imagine why you would possibly do that.
I don't consider that a manifestation of identity politics. I consider having a constitution that says only some people are citizens to be a manifestation of identity politics.
Well, what do you think changed it across time? And look, let's get our definitions straight here. You can't lump all occurrences of non-equal treatment into the category of identity politics. Identity politics is a very specific thing. It's really only existed since the 1970s. You can't go back into 1770 and say that the founders of the American Constitution were playing identity politics.
They were playing politics that was based on identity. That's my definition of identity politics.
That's not the definition of identity politics unless you play fast and loose with the definition. Identity politics is something that's... No one talked about identity politics 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's a new term. You can't say that people's proclivity to identify with their group is identity politics. That's just tribalism. And that's like, who knows how old that is? 1 million years old. 500,000 years old. And you're going to call tribalism identity politics? Well, that's not helpful. If you want to talk about tribalism, we could talk about tribalism. But identity politics is something that's nested inside a particular political view of the world. It's got a Marxist basis, and it manifests itself in postmodernism. And it emerged in the American France first in the 1970s, and then has swept through the American universities and increasingly the rest of the West since then. That's identity politics. If you want to talk about tribalism, that's fine. I'm not a fan of tribalism, which is why I don't like the identity politics types. And I don't care if they're on the right or the left. I think the right-wing use of identity as the primary marker for human categorization is as reprehensible and dangerous as it is on the left. My problem with the left at the moment, the fundamental problem with the radical left, is that they're hyper-dominant in academia. And that's not good. And that's not my opinion. You can go look at Jonathan Haidt's data and see for yourself. And he's as moderate a person as you could hope to find, and probably less prone to anger than me.
And I agree with you. I find a lot of students phenomenally irritating, but I would question how much power they have in contrast to the things that I find more worrying that are happening in the world today, right? Or even the professors, right? Even the professors.
20-year-olds don't have that much power, but they're not 20 forever. 10 years later, they're 30. And 20 years later, they're 40.
Right.
And whatever happens in the university happens everywhere 5 years later.
And very, very sadly for people in my politics, left-wing politics, what happens to people as they get older is that they've traditionally got more conservative. So I don't think you can make a case that the current, where people are when they're 20 today is actually going to be the ideology that takes them all the way through their life. That's never been the case so far.
No, but it'll be around long enough to do plenty of damage, like it already is.
Okay, but even if we accept that students and their POMO professors are quite annoying, which I think is probably something I agree with
they're
you
not
on.
just annoying. Like, they're destroying the universities, and that's not a good thing. And they're particularly destroying the social sciences and the humanities. The sciences are safe so far, but not for long, because the scientists in particular are terrible at politics, and the left-wing activists are great at politics. And so they'll win eventually. The National Science Foundation is already introducing diversity requirements for hiring in mathematics in universities. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to work. There are hardly any mathematical geniuses. If you start putting all sorts of arbitrary restrictions on their hiring, you're just going to end up not finding the ones that there are. So, besides,
I don't think that's true, actually, because if you say there are very few mathematical
what do you know about it?
Well, next year I'm going to be a fellow at Oxford University, so I spend time talking to academics. I've talked to a lot of academics for my book. I do agree with you, there is an illiberal strain that is sweeping through a lot of universities. I don't think it's an existential threat, and I certainly don't think it is, to me, the biggest issue in world politics today. It's the one that I would choose personally.
What do you think is the biggest issue?
I think that the rise of strongmen, authoritarians around the world is very worrying, and that's one of the reasons that I find the subtitle of your book fascinating, because it's called An Antidote to Chaos. Why isn't it an antidote to order, which you also say in its excessive manifestations is bad?
I've said that. Well, you can't write a book about everything.
No, but you've specifically chosen Antidote to Chaos, so why is chaos
the big... I have 300 lectures online, and I talk plenty about the pathology of order in those lectures.
Okay, but I'm just saying...
I'm no fan of authoritarian strongmen, that's for sure.
Well, that's good, but I do think that the way that you talk about order in the book is something that people will take away from it.
Be specific.
Okay, so let me think. The way that you talk about natural dominance hierarchies in lobsters. Let's get on to the lobsters. Because I think that the thing that people take away from that is male lobsters compete for female lobsters.
And that's the
something about society.
There's a heart in the box anyway.
Men need to be dominant in society. Because if lobsters do it, then there is something that we can read about humans from that too.
There's nothing in that chapter at all that suggests that the way that men should succeed in human hierarchies is a consequence of the exercise of power. There's not one line in that entire book that claims that, because it's not what I believe. Most human hierarchies, as I already pointed out, are hierarchies of competence, not power.
Okay, so
that's why we don't live in a patriarchal tyranny. And so if you want to be a successful man, then you should be competent. And that will move you up the hierarchy. And that will make you attractive, and for good reason, unless you want an incompetent mate, which is possible and happens, but isn't something that I would recommend. People will sometimes choose an incompetent mate because they're intimidated by competence. And so they'll settle for someone who they don't respect because they feel that they can master them and they won't be intimidated. But it's not a recipe for a happy life, I can tell you that. So there isn't a line in that chapter that talks about power as the proper means of conducting yourself in life. There's not a line in the book, and there's nothing in anything I've ever said that suggests that.
Okay, no,
but it's really important because people have read this chapter and they make exactly the argument that you make, and it's a misapprehension. So it's a misapprehension of the book.
Okay, but if so many people are getting the same misapprehension, could it be possible?
There aren't so many people that are getting it. There's 2 million people that have bought the book, and there's a very small handful of people who have a particular ideological perspective who enjoy developing that perspective because it indicates just what sort of reprehensible individual I am. But it has absolutely nothing to do with what I wrote or what I've said or what I believe. I don't believe that our fundamental hierarchies are based on power. I don't believe that the way that you move up our hierarchies is as a consequence of manifesting power. It's competence.
Okay, my big problem with the lobsters is that it's scientifically bollocks, right? It's just, you cannot read across from lobsters and what they do to what humans do.
Of course you can. That's why serotonin works on lobsters.
But it works in 2 different ways. So if serotonin makes lobsters more aggressive, it makes humans less aggressive, right? That's what happens.
No, that's not right. Serotonin makes human beings more dominant but less aggressive. And the only reason it makes them more dominant is because they're less irritable and they're less defensively aggressive. So it's not bollocks. I know my neurochemistry. So if you're going to play neurochemistry, let's go and do it.
Okay, well, you say antidepressants work on lobsters.
Yes, they do. They make a lobster that's been defeated in a fight more likely to fight again.
That's not the same mechanism that happens in humans.
Yes,
lobsters don't get depressed as the way that humans are. I think you're anthropomorphizing into a ridiculous degree. These are creatures that urinate out of their faces.
I think that the fundamental issue among knowledgeable animal behaviorists is that anthropomorphization with animals is generally the appropriate tactic unless you have reason to doubt it, which is because there's continuity between us and animals rather than discontinuity. And the idea that the anthropomorphization of animals is inappropriate is something derived from behaviorism. The highly
didn't come to help me with the boss.
Neuroscientists and people who study motivation and emotion as well as neurochemistry know perfectly well that there is biological and behavioral continuity across the animal kingdom and way down into the kingdom as well, which is exactly why I chose lobsters, to indicate that there is so much continuity in the systems that allow us to estimate status position that we share it with creatures that are 1/3 of a billion years old. And the reason that I made that argument was to put paid, at least in part, to the absurd Marxist proposition that hierarchical structures are a secondary consequence of Western civilization and free market economies, which is as preposterous a perspective as you could possibly develop about anything. Hierarchies are 1/3 of a billion years old. You can't blame them on the West or men or capitalism. And we're wired for hierarchical perception in ways that you can hardly possibly imagine. Even our ability to rank order a set of objects seems to be tightly linked to our ability to assess the relative status of people in our social milieus. So, and the biochemistry is very, very similar, and the reason we know that is because most of the drugs that are used on people are first tested on animals. Now, it's not often animals as primitive as lobsters, but it is plenty. So a lot of what we know about neurological structure, for example, is a consequence of studying the flatworm, which is a much more primitive organism than the lobster. Continuity is the rule.
Okay, so what can we learn from killer whales that live in matriarchal pods, often led by a grandmother, someone who's been through a menopause? Why isn't that an example that you've picked to talk about in the book? It's because lobsters say the thing that ideologically you want to talk about, which is your belief that there is a kind of Marxist ideology sweeping.
How do lobsters say that? The point that I was making with lobsters, I just said what it was. That hierarchies have been around for a very long time.
But who genuinely, really, today is arguing, apart from maybe 3 mad Marxist academics, that there is no such thing as hierarchy? Hierarchies
They're not arguing that there's no such thing as hierarchy.
Oh, there should be no such thing as hierarchies.
Oh, there are plenty of them are arguing that.
Really? Because I see that almost never in the wild as an argument. I see people think that hierarchy should be based on merit and they should be more equal.
What do you think the demand for equality of outcome is if it's not an attempt to flatten hierarchies or to eliminate them? What else could it possibly be? And you don't think the neo-Marxists and the postmodernists think that hierarchy is a social construction? Like, you're not talking about the same people that I know, right. That's for sure. Everything's a social construction for the social constructionists, including hierarchies.
But I just don't think that is a very widely held view in the world. It might be among liberal arts universities.
20% of social scientists identify as Marxist.
Where's that statistic from?
Look it up in Haidt's work.
Okay. I'm interested. I know.
I've checked it out quite carefully.
Yeah, but
it's a perfectly valid statistic. I don't have the reference at hand.
Yeah.
So it's 1 in 5. Okay, and the number of conservatives, or even liberals for that matter, in the social sciences and humanities is not only vanishingly small, but getting smaller. And you think the social constructionists believe that hierarchy is built into biology? They're not very good social constructionists if that's what they believe. And the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists are radical social constructionists because they wouldn't believe that human beings are infinitely malleable and that we can be recreated in whatever image the ideologues might want to recreate us in if they didn't think that. And it's much more prevalent than you're admitting. I mean, there isn't a competing position on campuses except among the evolutionary biologists and the evolutionary psychologists, let's say, and they're under complete attack. They're certainly next on the chopping block as far as I can tell. I've been warning them for the last 2 years. Social constructionists don't like evolutionary psychologists and they don't like biology. And I really don't understand why, except that it interferes with this idea that human beings are infinitely malleable and stops them from being able to blame hierarchy on the West. Look, if you're really concerned about the poor, as a social democrat, let's say, the first thing you should do is abandon your presupposition that the dispossession produced by hierarchies is a consequence of the patriarchal structure of the West. It's a way deeper problem than that. So there have been people who've been dispossessed forever, way before capitalism.
Okay, I think I would agree with that. So if it is a way deeper problem than that, how do you tackle it?
I don't know.
Well, that's a bit... I mean, that for someone as intelligent as you, that just throw their hands up and go, ooh, maybe some people
There's lots of things I don't know how to tackle. I don't know how to tackle the fact that people range extremely widely in their cognitive ability either. These are big problems.
Right, but we could start with a redistributive tax policy, right, where people who earn a lot pay more tax than people lower down the income scale to redistribute income. That was a fairly obvious way that you could make poor people less poor. It's something that, the Labour government did. They almost, I think they halved child poverty. It is possible to do things, and we do have mechanisms.
Well, I wouldn't make the immediate presumption that it was the redistributive tax policy that halved child poverty. You know that absolute poverty in the world has halved between the year 2000 and 2012, and you can't attribute that to redistributive policies.
No, I can't. I'm only talking about Britain. I'm talking about that particular government, which had, then there are fiscal analyses that have been done. But I think, let's move on from lobsters. I mean,
That chapter is about people becoming responsible and competent, not about them becoming dominant and powerful.
Okay,
it's not that at all.
But my problem with it is I think you got criticised by a lot of marine biologists, right, and by a lot of geneticists
I think
for
one.
it. Okay, well, I can name you. P.Z. Myers is one who's criticised you. Adam Rutherford, who's former editor of Nature, has criticised that chapter. There are, is not... But what I think is fascinating is that...
No reasonable biologists dispute the fact that most organisms organize themselves into hierarchies, and that the fundamental biological mechanism for the regulation of hierarchy is the serotonin system. That's not disputable. Now, you can find animal organizational structures that vary from that, what would you call it, fundamental pattern. But the existence of variance isn't proof against the existence of a fundamental pattern. I don't know how you can sit there and be skeptical about this. If you know the literature on hierarchical structure, you understand that across the entire animal kingdom, animals tend to organize themselves into hierarchies.
But
and that the neurochemistry
but very
of the
different types of hierarchies, right? So
there's a pattern. That's why we know they're hierarchies.
Right. Yeah, but like you say, the pattern as if that's
the hierarchy is the pattern.
Right. Okay, and that's fine. So chimps have one very obvious social structure, and bonobos have another.
It's not
one.
as different as people have made it out to be. No. The bonobos are a lot more violent than the
and they're not hippie monkeys, right?
Observers of the bonobos have admitted.
Okay, but nonetheless, you say that as if those little details don't matter, as if there can't be such a thing as a hierarchy that is much worse than another hierarchy. That's my problem with it.
I'm not saying that at all. There's clearly hierarchies that are worse than other hierarchies.
Right.
Baboons have terrible hierarchies, for example.
And
tyrannical hierarchies aren't my cup of tea.
Right.
That isn't the point I was making.
No.
The point I was making was that hierarchies can't be blamed on capitalism or the West. They're built into our biology. The neurochemistry is so old that we share it with crustaceans, so that's 1/3 of a billion years, which is the proof that hierarchies aren't a recent construct. If proof like that needs to be provided, and that the best way for people to adopt a strategy that will move them up the hierarchy, which is a desirable thing in most regards, is to face the suffering of the world forthrightly. That's what that chapter is about. And the people who've been criticizing it read it as if it's a defense of the Western patriarchy. It's like there's no defense of the Western patriarchy.
I don't think that's true. I think the way that people criticize it is and I think this happens a lot with evolutionary psychology, is which is not quite what the lobsters are, but is where other stuff in the book is. Other things you said, for example, like women wear rouge because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Right. Well, for a start,
why do you think women wear rouge?
I have absolutely no idea, but I will tell you...
That's really not a very good answer.
Well, yeah, you said before there were lots of things you don't know the answer to, but I'll tell you one thing.
I'm not criticizing your perspective on this. You're criticizing mine, so I'm presuming you have an alternative idea. Why do you think women wear makeup? Well, why do you think
there are an enormous... But let's go back to why women wear rouge, because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Okay, first of all, not all ripe fruit is red. Why would you want to...
Do you want colour vision to detect ripe fruit? Eh?
Do you want to eat women? No. I think unless men are having sex with ripe fruit,
taste them.
That's not really where... And where is the evidence that women who are redder in the cheeks have more offspring?
What do you think happens during the sexual...
I know heaps of situations where women have been...
Actually, if this is a sexual selection, that women who are redder...
There's like heaps of terms where women go on about how...
hallmarks of youthful skin is the...
How they say stuff like, my baby is so precious, I could eat him.
It's a primary sign.
So they say that stuff as well.
I think you're using...
Wait a second here. What do you think women wear makeup for? Come on, if you're going to go after me on this,
okay.
Let's women. People say, well, women wear makeup to feel better about themselves. It's not a very deep analysis. Why makeup? Why facial makeup?
I'll tell you why I wear makeup, which is to stop the comments that I would get if I didn't wear makeup. And my gender, I always say my gender is low maintenance, right? I don't feel particularly like a woman inside. I don't really know what that would mean. But what I try and do is try and look, in the same way that you get black women who talk about the problem with natural hair, is it's seen as unprofessional, right? And as a woman, if you don't wear makeup, that is seen as a political choice. That is seen as something that, you are...
So you wear makeup to protect yourself from what? From tyrannical men?
No, but tyrannical women as well, I would say. I think women very harshly judge each other's appearance, and there are very good reasons for that.
It's probably because they've learned that from oppressive men.
No, I don't think so.
Why do you think it is, then?
I think that women are encouraged to be seen as being in competition with each other.
Encouraged? You don't think that there's anything about that that's natural, eh?
Well, I would be reluctant to get into that, because I think you could talk about intrasexual competition. I think that's a very big deal among the social sciences and evolutionary science. It's not my particular competence. But yeah, my conception of the patriarchy is not that men are beastly to women. It is that there is a structure in which women participate too that overall privileges and benefits men in order to control female reproduction. And I think those are two very different things. You write in 12 Rules that you skipped a grade in school and you were small for your age. Do you think that shaped your personality and your experiences of life?
Well, it did to some degree. Made it difficult for me to participate in sports. So I didn't really do anything that was fundamentally athletic till I was in graduate school. So my parents are guilty about that because they felt that it wasn't good for me, but I'm not unhappy about it. I got through school faster. I wasn't a fan of school, and the faster I got through it, the better. I think it might have encouraged me to do two other things, which was I probably hung around with rougher kids that I might have otherwise, partly as a compensation, I suppose, for being smart and academically able and also small. So I probably exaggerated my roughness, I suppose. And it made me more capable of verbally defending myself. But other than that, I don't think it had much of an effect. I think I pretty much left all of that behind.
That's very good. Also, the other thing I was really interested to read was that you married your teenage sweetheart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I met her when I was 8. So we've known each other for 50 years, yeah.
So this is, I think, really fascinating. So I read that and I thought that was quite moving. And then I was reading the bit about, the animal kingdom, and the bit for you take away from the lobster section is that, what happens if you're top lobster is that you get to impregnate all the females. That's as being evolutionarily successful as a lobster, right? Mm-hmm.
That's proclivity towards polygamy, which is one of the things that pulls on human society.
Right, and you're now the pretty big lobster. And yet you are monogamous, you're faithful to your wife, you don't want to go around impregnating every woman that you see, right?
No, one woman's enough trouble.
Right. So I think that's to me that was really interesting, because that's a way in which we are very obviously very different from animal society. And
Castle's a bit confusing.
There are plenty of societies where exactly that happens.
Right, but you've been able to overcome that biological urge, right? And so in the sense that maybe there are other biological urges, such as men's propensity towards violence, that might also be overcome.
Well, it's not self-evident that you want it to be overcome. I mean, you don't know what goes along with it. You know, I mean, obviously, first of all, defining violence isn't that straightforward. How about use of force in self-defense? Does that constitute violence?
I think to me that's a separate category of violence. I think
well,
self-defense.
But it's not that easy to distinguish them. Like if you're, what you want to do with a child who's aggressive is socialize them so that they become sophisticated in their manifestation of their aggression. You don't want to inhibit it. You certainly don't want to socialize little boys to be more like little girls. That's, first of all, you don't know how to do it to begin with. But second of all, it's not an advisable strategy. So. Well,
I found that really interesting, because in the book you say that actually if you feminize men, that might give them more of a, might have more of an allure towards these very fascistic ideologies.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. That's standard psychoanalytic. That's like psychoanalysis 101. If you repress something, it comes back with a vengeance.
Okay, so tell me what you mean by feminizing in that sense. Because to me, if you don't mind me saying so, you are a man who is quite feminine. You're in touch with your feminine side. You are very well dressed. You talk a lot about your diet. You've talked about your emotions.
I hate talking about my diet.
Right, but you cry in public. You enjoy spending time with your kids. All of these things that are not
sad, isn't it?
But they're not stereotypically male, and I think that's very admirable.
Pretty strange behaviour for a patriarchal tyrant.
Well, that's why I think that you're probably, in some ways, you're not a patriarchal tyrant, or that actually all of our programming, if you want to call it that in biology, is overcomable, because you are...
It's integratable.
Right, but you are a man who some people would say has a lot of feminine traits like that, and I don't... Do you think that means that you are now being in the allure of authoritarian fascistic ideologies because you're baking cakes?
Oh, I notice the allure.
And then what do you do with that?
Work to live such that there's no temptation in that, which is also what I recommend to everyone else.
Right.
If you see any temptation in that, then you should straighten yourself up real quick. And that's what I've done for decades. So of course you have to see the allure in that. If you don't see the allure in it, you're a fool, just like if you don't see the allure in the radical leftist ideas. I mean, if you didn't understand the allure, you couldn't understand the ideas. They're dangerously alluring. It'd be lovely if there was a strong man who could solve all our problems, and those who deserved it got exactly what was coming to them. It's not something that I would recommend as a wish. But that doesn't mean you want to be blind to its attraction. You want to see what the dark parts of you are attracted to. It helps you keep an eye on where things can go if they go badly sideways. So I don't think it has anything to do, though, with my what would you say, more classically feminine interests. Not as far as I can tell. I mean, I have all sorts of classically masculine interests too, so
right, and
it seems to be reasonably well balanced.
Right, so you talk then about we shouldn't socialise little boys like little girls, but actually, I have lots of stereotypes. I'm interested in politics, which is overwhelmingly male-dominated. You have lots of classically feminine interests. Why, what is the problem here with people having personalities that are a mixture?
There's no problem with that at all. The problem is when it's dictated by fiat.
Well, I mean, who's fiat?
How about the education system?
So in schools, you think that there is.
Well, I outlined. I can't remember the psychologist's name at the moment, but he was quite influential in the 1980s, who recommended as a control for male violence that boys be socialized more like little girls. And I don't think that that's a particularly unpopular viewpoint. So on the de-emphasis on competition, for example, in games, the increase in the rise of competitive games where scores aren't kept, that sort of thing, is all a manifestation of that kind of theory as far as I'm concerned. The idea that there's something intrinsically wrong with competition, it's a very foolish idea, especially if you want to motivate relatively aggressive boys, because they're competitive. Well, competition, that's not good. Someone has to lose. It's like, well, you're not going to get very far looking at the world that way, I'm afraid. Maybe you want to generate a plethora of games so that everybody has a shot at winning. That's a good idea, but you certainly don't want to devalue the notion of winning. If you're doing something necessary, you should reward people who are particularly good at it. It's part of the definition of it being necessary. So, and you don't want to control aggression any more than you want to control sex. You want to integrate it. And if it's integrated, that's the integration of the shadow from the Jungian perspective, and something I talk a lot about in my lectures. It's like you need to have the capacity for danger. You need to be dangerous, but you need to learn how to not use it except when it's necessary. And that is not the same as being harmless. Harmless, that's a terrible virtue. It's like a rabbit. There's nothing virtuous about harmlessness. It just means you're ineffectual.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Well, I think there are some people who, through their harmlessness, become iconic and they become symbols. I think the Gandhi and the principle of non-violence.
He's not harmless. He just transcended his deep violence. That is a completely different thing.
Okay.
Without that capacity, there would have been no way he would have had the strength of character that he had. He was an integrated person, not a harmless person.
Okay.
That's a very, very different thing.
Did you have different ambitions for your daughter and for your son?
Some of them were different. I encouraged my daughter in her desire to be a mother, which is not something I did with my son.
Did you encourage him in his desire to be a father?
Absolutely.
Right. So you encourage both of them to be a parent.
Right, but those are different.
Yeah.
I
believe.
And yeah, I mean, and in some sense, I think it's harder for young women because, of course, the problem of integrating family with career is a more complex problem for women to solve. So, and I spent a lot of time talking to her about how she might solve that. I wouldn't say that we came up with anything that was spectacularly original or successful, but I at least let her know that whatever pathway she chose was fine with me as long as she was being honest with herself about what it was that she wanted. But also that, I'm not a fan of the idea that the most fundamental orientation that a person is likely to have in their life is career. I don't believe that's true for most people. I certainly don't believe it's true for most women. And I think the evidence supports that claim quite straightforwardly. So,
however, it is the only thing that you get paid for under capitalism. Right?
Man, live.
But that's
How can
true.
you say something like that? It's so cliched.
Well,
it's so painful to hear that.
It may be cliche, but it nonetheless is true, right?
Look,
Women do
it's
more,
not
much
capitalism.
more. Well,
for God's sake.
It is.
No, it isn't. You have to invest into a child for 18 years before they have any economic utility. Mm-hmm. It's a consequence of delayed economic utility. We don't know how to monetize it. It's not a consequence of capitalism. It's a consequence of the fact that human beings have an 18-year dependency. How do you monetize that? Even in principle.
Well,
we don't know.
We did used to send them up chimneys, to be fair. And at that point, what's
true.
really interesting is at that point, children were seen as being much more the property of the man. And as they become economically useless, all the legal studies show that that's when we start moving to a model of female custody, right? Because it was about caring labour. But this is the point I'm making. Is
model. Look, I'll tell you, there are plenty of men who are not very happy about the model of female custody. And that would, include the... 85% of men who are essentially denied 50-50 custody when they divorce and have young children. So I wouldn't think that one of our major problems, or at least a major unidimensional problem, is the proclivity of men to foist off the custody of their children onto women. There's certainly another side of that argument.
There is, and I do think that actually a lot of anger has been generated by the way we have in Britain, anyway, or England and Wales, we have an adversarial fault-based divorce system, and that's something that's changing. But what it does is encourage people to come in on day one and say, if you want to get divorced, you're going to have to make out a case that the other person has been a bastard.
It doesn't matter, because if you move to a non-fault-based divorce system, then all that happens is the fault shifts to who should get custody. So it doesn't remove the acrimony by any stretch of the imagination. It just shifts it to custody of the children. That's what's happened in Canada.
Right. And in Britain, we actually talk about access rather than custody, because the idea is not that you own the children, it's that you actually want to be able to see the children and spend time with them. And I think that's really important. But fault-based divorce is something that increases the chances of couples having a bad divorce, right? That's the problem, is it sets people against each other from the start. They have to go into court and contest that the other person has done something wrong, which is not a great base on which to start then an argument about what you're going to settle.
You think people should be encouraged to divorce even if no one's done anything wrong?
No, I think that having to prove that in a court of law is not something that is going to lead you to a better arbitration about settling money and settling access to children. I think that's the point. You have a ridiculous situation where couples who say, well, actually, we've just grown apart, nonetheless, unless they want to wait 5 years or 2 years for separation, they have to go in and plead unreasonable behaviour to get a divorce and start splitting up their assets. that's the joy of no-fault divorce, is that you don't have to make those contested cases. You can simply say, our marriage is no longer working, and part ways without going into all of that acrimony. That seems quite sensible to me.
It also seems quite naive to me.
Well,
I've seen very few non-acrimonious divorces. They're very hard on kids. So I don't think anything that makes them easier is a very good idea. It might be good in the short term, but it's not good in the long term. Unless you don't think that marriage is a useful institution. And if you think that it's part of the patriarchal tyranny, then you might think that as well. So, but it's a very useful institution, mostly for kids. So
I agree that I'm married. Modern marriage has a lot to recommend it. I do also think it is a patriarchal institution. It is literally...
Of course you think that. Well, because you think virtually everything that occurs in our society is a patriarchal institution. And it's easy to think that because then you only have to think one thing. You have a one-thing answer for everything. You could let me... It's part of the patriarchal institution.
I don't think you're obeying the rule that says maybe treat people as if they have something worth hearing, so...
I'm not making a case for the patriarchal tyranny. And I don't think you are either. I think that you're making a case that's like a universally cliched case for the patriarchal tyranny. I don't see too much of you reflected in your articles at all.
Why do women change their names on marriage traditionally?
I don't know exactly. Why do you think they do?
Because it was to symbolise the transfer of their ownership from one family to another family. That's why in The Handmaid's Tale you have off Warren, off Glenn.
Oh, God, Margaret Atwood. Well, she was just about devoured by the feminists last year, so that was something interesting to observe.
I think she made a very good point. She wasn't devoured by all feminists. I'm a feminist. I thought what she said about due process in cases like that is perfectly reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Well, many people didn't.
No, but then, guess what? This is on the internet. You can find someone who disagrees with pretty much anything. Mm-hmm. But so why do you think women change their names when they get married traditionally? If it's not about transfer of property ownership traditionally?
I don't know if I have an opinion about that. The specific reasons for that, I'd have to look into it for a fair amount of time before I decided it, but I certainly wouldn't boil it down to a unidimensional argument about the ownership of women by men. So, okay. I mean, the part of the problem too is with this sort of discussion is that it's, and this is why I consider it a manifestation of ideological possession. It's predictable.
Well, that's what...
knowing your stance on...
But having a coherent ideology does mean that it is predictable, because
you don't need an ideology.
It is one logical thing that flows from another, and all those pieces tessellate together. That's what I find very interesting about your thinking. I find it quite slightly baffling, is that I don't really see how all the pieces fit together. You say that you're not, you believe in God, but there's a lot of emphasis about going back to...
No, I actually say I act as if God exists.
Right. But,
which is actually my definition of belief.
Okay, but that then doesn't, to me, tessellate very obviously with your insistence that actually it's just about pure science, and there's not a because I can
what insistence that it's just about pure science?
Well,
I wrote Maps of Meaning. There's no insistence in that it's just about pure science.
Okay, but you make appeals to science.
Different.
You make appeals to science all the time. You say, well, this is what the literature says, and the trouble with God is that ultimately you can't say this is what the literature says. There is no literature.
Which is why I don't say anything about the scientific status of God, apart from what can be experienced maybe under certain conditions of what would you call chemical-induced mysticism, which seems to be something that you can say something scientifically about. But I see that there's two different realms, right? There's a realm of values and a realm of facts. And in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme. But it doesn't in the realm of values. You have to look elsewhere. That was what the humanities were for, before they got, what would you say, hijacked by ideologues. And, the idea that something should be consistent. You were talking about the necessity for consistency in ideology. It's like, I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting, because I don't know anything about you. I could replace you with someone else who thinks the same way. And that means you're not here. That's what it means. It's not pleasant. So you're not integrating the specifics of your personal experience with what you've been taught to synthesize something that's genuine and surprising and engaging in a narrative sense as a consequence. And that's the pathology of ideological possession. It's not good. And it's not good that I know where you stand on things. Once I know a few things, it's like, why have a conversation? I already know where you stand on things.
I bet you don't know where I stand on all things.
I would hope that was true.
Okay, let's talk about transgender issues. That's fun. What do you think I think about transgender issues?
I suspect that you think that gender expression, gender identity are fundamentally social constructs, but I could be wrong.
No, I believe that there are definitely some biological differences between the sexes. We've observed them. I do believe that gender is a hugely powerful social structure that we've built on top of that it is largely, but not entirely, socially constructed. I think when you look back through the history, biological differences have consistently shrunk, like we were talking in the 18th...
They haven't in Scandinavia, they've magnified.
Okay, but we were talking in the 18th...
That's actually an important exception, because Scandinavia has gone farther than any other area, the Scandinavian countries, in establishing egalitarian social policy. And the differences in interest and career choice and personality between men and women have grown as a consequence, not shrunk, which is exactly the opposite of what the social construction is predicting.
But also just suggests that they're malleable, actually, rather than fixed.
Well, of course they're malleable. No one would ever suggest otherwise.
Right. So that's what I mean. So I think
they're not malleable in the direction that the social constructionists presume. As you flatten out the sociological landscape, you maximize the biological differences. No one saw that coming. And you might think, well, it's a handful of right-wing scientists who are pushing that. It's like, no, it's not. It's mainstream psychology, and there aren't any radical right-wingers in mainstream psychology. And everyone who discovered that was absolutely shocked by it. And these papers have been cited by thousands of people, and they have tens of thousands of subjects, and they've been done on virtually national-level samples, cross-culturally.
But I also think the behaviour in Scandinavia has changed. For example, a lot more men take paternity leave now, that there is a portion that is reserved purely for men. That doesn't seem to be making them wildly unhappy. So I think that there are definitely behavioural things that are susceptible to nudges by society, by government and by the state, and that do change the way that people behave.
Yeah, that seems
so we can kind
plausible.
Of meet in the middle on that one.
We know that people can be educated and that we can develop as a consequence of learning. That's certainly not a disputable proposition.
And I also believe that there is no evidence for gender identity in the way that it is used as an idea of a soul. I think that that's the way that it's often used to me.
By who?
By transgender activists.
Yes, well,
I think it's all about having a female soul, and that to me seems strange. I don't see how you can...
something like biological determinism.
Right.
Which is very... It's one of the things that's so perversely amusing about these sorts of arguments is that, well, but I attribute it to the lack of demand for logical consistency as a consequence of postmodern thinking. You can believe one thing when it's convenient in one situation and another thing when it's convenient for another. So we're in the perverse position where if you're a man born in a woman's body, that's biologically determined. But if you're a woman born in a woman's body, that's socially constructed. It's like, okay, good luck with that theory.
Right. I don't believe you can be a man born in a woman's body or a woman born in a man's body. What I believe is that there are some people who feel alienation towards their bodies and they want to remove body
everybody
parts.
Feels that.
Right, but they'd feel it to such an extent that clinically the best treatment for them is to transition and live as if they were the other sex.
Yeah, well, I don't think that there's any evidence that that's clinically the best treatment. We certainly don't know enough to make that presupposition, and I think we're playing with fire assuming that that's the case. The long-term outcome studies certainly don't demonstrate that. So it's not so.
I would make a very big distinction there between adults and between children. I think
that would be a good distinction to make.
Right,
yeah.
But I think we are very quick to diagnose and treat children in a way that I find, and not waiting for the research, and that I find concerning.
Yeah. Well, the lawsuits will put an end to that in about 15 years.
So there's one place that we have found from which that is something that gets me a lot of hate, right?
I'm sure it does.
A turf and a bigot for that. So
right.
I don't think that's something that you would have been able to predict, that I think, because that is not now the orthodox feminist position.
I agree completely.
Oh, isn't that good?
So congratulations.
We've all learned something.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to talk quickly about Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me your reaction to what's unfolded over the last year. I won't put words in your mouth. You tell me.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of evidence for reprehensible sexual behavior on the part of people who can use power to get away with it. So that's not so good. The Me Too movement, I suspect it probably did some good things and some terrible things. So I would say that there's a dangerous proclivity to abandon the concept of the presumption of innocence. So in university campuses, for example, we're moving towards a preponderance of evidence model. I'm not very happy with that model. I think that's a very big mistake. The presumption of innocence is nothing short of a miracle, and we abandon it at our extreme peril. So I'm not happy with that. I think the believe the victim idea is something that only a fool could conjure up, because it opens the door to unbelievable opportunity for manipulation.
I think that I would disagree with you slightly on that, because I think what that means is what people are arguing for is don't instantly dismiss or disbelieve the victim, right? Which is a very different...
No, that's partly what they're arguing for. There's plenty of people who are arguing for the fundamental attitude to be believe the victim. So some people are arguing to not automatically disbelieve the victim, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to argue for, but that isn't where it ends. So
okay, climate change. I saw you posting a link to a study suggesting that a lot of the way that it's talked about has been overhyped. What are your beliefs about climate change?
Well, I spent a lot of time. I don't really have beliefs about climate change. I wouldn't say. I mean, I think the climate is probably warming, but it's been warming since the last ice age. So I don't know.
But it's
exactly
dramatically accelerated even in the last couple of decades.
Maybe. And possibly. It's not so obvious. I spent quite a bit of time going through the relevant literature. I read about 200 books on ecological, what would you call it, on ecology and economy when I worked for the UN for about a 2-year period, and it's not so obvious what's happening, just like with any complex system. The problem I have fundamentally isn't really a climate change issue. It's that I find it very difficult to distinguish valid environmental claims from environmental claims that are made as a what would you call it, secondary anti-capitalist front, essentially. So it's so politicized that it's very difficult to parse out the data from the politicization.
So I saw there was a line in 12 Rules which says people stricken with poverty don't care about carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
And I think that's not an unreasonable point to make, because you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? People, if you can't eat, then actually you can't really worry about what's happening in 50 years to the planet. However, I don't think that's a reason not to tackle climate change, because those same people in the global south...
It's partly a reason.
Is it, though? Because people in the global south...
coal-generated plants stop people from starving, so yes, it's partly a reason. And it's certainly the case that making energy more expensive, obviously, makes things more difficult for poor people. So yes, it's definitely an issue. And I would say, it's kind of a conundrum for those on the left. It's like, what's it going to be? Clean air or hungry people? Think, well, we don't have to choose. It's like, okay.
Or renewable energy, or...
Oh, good luck with that.
Or nuclear power. I'd be fine with more nuclear power stations.
Yeah, well, it doesn't look like we're moving in that direction very fast.
No, but that is a solution.
Well, it worked for the French.
I was fascinated. David Attenborough is something kind of close to a national religion in Britain. So there's a bit where you say population control advocates like him, you compare them to Eric Harris, one of the Columbine killers. Why then is it virtuous to propose that the planet might be better off if there were fewer people on it? And I found that completely boggling, that you have elided their population control through people not being born and the mass slaughter of people who are already alive.
It's the motivation that I question.
Right. Tell me more about that.
Well, what kind of statement is the planet would be better off with fewer people on it? First of all, there's an easy solution to that. You could leave.
Unfortunately, much the best efforts of Elon Musk, that is not yet an option permanently.
No, that isn't what I mean. That's what I meant, yes. If you're very concerned about your carbon footprint, there's a very fast solution to that. So, and I think it's disingenuous to, it's the other people, or maybe it's the people who haven't been born yet. It's like, this is also the problem I have with much of the environmentalist movement, is there's a powerful stream of anti-human sentiment that motivates it, and masquerading under the guise of virtue on a planetary scale. It's like, could be. I mean, it's not like we're not fouling our own nest, But
that's why I'm fascinated by where you come from this, because the book, is so much about things being in balance and harmony, right? And order and chaos outweigh each other. Well, what overpopulation has done is got to the same point.
Who says we have overpopulation?
Well, I think that it's very difficult to see under the current model of fossil fuel-based capitalism. Sorry to use that word. I know it upsets you.
But that is what you
until we've run out, when we run out of fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Well, it will happen.
Yeah.
Because there is
people have been saying that's going to happen for 50 years, and now the United States is a net exporter of fossil fuel.
Right.
And so no one saw that coming, did they? but it happened.
And you're right, that might be the case, but at the moment I would say that, China is putting up new coal-fired power stations, by the bucket load.
Yeah.
It is entirely possible that the stuff that the developed nations did, that now developing nations did, and now doing to make themselves richer.
They'll get concerned about clean air when they get richer. That's what the data indicate. Once you get GDP up to about $5,000 per year, people start to become concerned with environmental issues. So if we make people rich fast enough, I don't think so. It'll happen too late for some things. It looks like we're going to top out at about $9 billion. I think we can handle that. I think probably one of the problems that'll beset us in 100 years, assuming there are even creatures like us around in 100 years, is that there'll be too few people, not too many. The projections top out at about $9 billion. It's only $2 billion more than we have now. There's every reason to assume that we can cope with that, especially given the rapid decreases in poverty around the world at the moment. There's a bit of a bottleneck. There'll probably be some more extinction. What we're doing to the oceans by overfishing doesn't seem very smart, but we've only been aware of our role as planetary stewards since 1960, I would say, and we're not doing too bad for people who just woke up to the fact that we're actually a planetary force. And I don't think that we're overpopulated. I think all the arguments that all the people who made those arguments in the 1960s, like Paul Ehrlich, I think he wrote The Population Bomb, predicted mass starvation by the year 2000. He was absolutely and completely wrong.
No, we've been very lucky with things like golden rice, for example, and genetic engineering of crops. I think that's
not luck.
No, it is. It is. I agree. Human ingenuity is a huge part of that, definitely.
Right. Well, and more people, more ingenuity. And Bjorn Lomborg, who I really admire, this skeptical environmentalist who's actually gone a very long ways to trying to figure out what we could do at a planetary level that would actually be useful and productive. His research has indicated the best possible investment isn't carbon tax, it isn't cessation of utilization of carbon-based fuel. It's probably investment in early infant care around the world, especially in developing countries. Seems right to me. He's done the analysis very carefully.
One more area that you've talked about that's caused controversy is gay parenting. You said the devil is in the detail and you want to see more studies on that. What do you think might be the adverse effects of having same-sex parents?
Well, I don't think we know what modeling is optimal for children. That's really the issue. I mean, I suspect that 2 parents are better than 1. Suspect, right? I don't know. 1 parent is definitely worse than 2. We know that. But we don't know what exposure to role models, say, is necessary for the continuity of maternal behavior or for the adoption of functional gender roles. We don't know any of that. And so that's the variable. Obviously, no one knows what the consequence of being raised with 2 people of the same sex is. Maybe none.
But so there doesn't seem to be any evidence so far. That's all the literature review suggests that there were a couple that showed problems, but they were in coupledoms that had already broken down, right? So there is no evidence. Maybe there will be some found, but at the moment there is no evidence that there is any problem with having gay parents.
And I never said there was. Somebody asked me, I believe it was a question like, if there was a problem, what would it be? It's something like that. I mean, you can make a very strong conservative case for gay marriage, I think. I mean, not that I would necessarily be motivated to make a conservative argument.
David Cameron, our former Prime Minister, said, I support gay marriage because I'm a conservative.
Yes, right. So, it's obviously homosexuality is... It's been around forever. So what's the appropriate social response to that? Well, conceivably, bringing as many people as possible into something approximating the same game. I think you could make a reasonable case for that. What's the consequence of that for children in those families? I don't know. Well, I mean, what I would say is, the obvious risk is that there's no one of the opposite sex around. I mean, it doesn't take it doesn't take the perception of genius to come up with the observation that might be a problem. Now, maybe it's not. And my suspicions are there's probably far more relevant problems with regards to what happens to children that isn't good than that.
Right. So this is a way in which, that is now a conservative position to hold. I think it's 20 years ago that would have been anathema to mainstream conservatives.
Well, people were concerned with the deterioration of marriage and believed that any additional transformations would further weaken it. And I think that that's not an unreasonable position, given how weak it's become. And I don't think that that's been good for people overall.
Okay, let's talk about free speech to finish on. You write in your book about Nietzsche, who became the Nazis' favourite intellectual, and you also talk about a professor...
Only through his sister's mistranslations of his work.
Right, but you talk a little bit as well about another professor whose ideas you thought led inevitably to kind of Maoism, and you said, I don't know how he can't be more worried about where his ideas lead. Do you worry about where where your work might be taken and used by other people? I saw you posing with...
I worry about that all the time.
With a Pepe flag.
Oh, I can't believe you brought that up.
Right, but I just think it's...
Seriously, I can't believe you brought that up. You should go online.
Yeah, I do.
There's a...
Believe me, I do.
There's a video called, I think it's called, Is Jordan Peterson a Darling of the Alt-Right? Have you watched the video of the person who put up that Pepe flag with me? He's online.
But
go watch it.
I have seen... You wouldn't, I would say...
And why are you concerned about Pepe anyways? Jesus, he disappeared like 3 years ago.
It is...
And most of that was trolling by young guys who were trying to drag the media into idiot accusations like the idea that this was a white supremacist gesture, which I was asked about on CBC. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was Fortran trolls playing the media for fools, which worked. And much of the Pepe thing was that as well.
Okay, but the problem with people ironically pretending to be Nazis on the internet...
They weren't pretending to be Nazis.
But no, this is a separate phenomenon, and 4chan definitely do ironically pretend to be all of the worst things they can possibly be, is that some people take that very seriously. There was a case in America recently of a guy who stabbed his father because he had thought that his father was a Democrat. He was writing stuff for a conservative website. He'd got very into the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
He's probably paranoid.
Right, so there are people who take this stuff very, very seriously, and they latch onto it.
What's your point?
I'm saying that, how much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly guys the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work, and say, I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
Okay.
Find some evidence. I'm extraordinarily sick and tired of this particular accusation/line of questioning. I'm no fan of the identitarian right, the ethno-nationalists, the alt-right. First of all, what do you mean by alt-right exactly? Do you mean ethno-nationalists? Do you mean white supremacists?
No, I mean people who are on the right but have got their power base outside the traditional media. They see themselves as an alternative. So I see them coming
That's a pretty loose definition of the alt-right.
Through that strain of Rush Limbaugh kind of talk radio, right? People who see themselves in opposition to an establishment.
Rush Limbaugh is not the alt-right. He's been around for 30 years.
Right, so he's the progenitor of what I see now, Breitbart and things like that, are the new media version of that very old media
Well, let's
format.
define what constitutes alt-right first. For me, they're ethno-nationalists. They tend to be white supremacists. And generally, when people tar me with an alt-right epithet, the reason they're doing that is to associate me with those people. They don't like me. And the reason for that is that I've made it very clear, not only in my videos, but on Twitter, that I don't like them. I don't like their anti-Semitism. I don't like their use of identity politics. I don't agree with their aims. I think that their notion is something like, well, if everybody's going to play identity politics, we're going to play it too, and we're going to win. And I can certainly understand that motivation, but I think it's a bad game all around. And I think the only reason that I was ever associated in any sense whatsoever with anything to do with the alt-right was because it was extremely convenient of the radical leftists, who I fundamentally detest, to paint me as a representative of that viewpoint.
Right.
Other than that, zero. Now,
but that's not what I did, you say. So at no point did I say you were...
Well, you brought up the whole Pepe
right,
thing.
But I did bring that up. But there was a reason I did that, which is that Nietzsche himself said, I'm an anti-Semite, right? And yet his ideology and his philosophy ended up being used by the Nazis. So my question to you is, how much responsibility do you feel about the way in which
It isn't even what I feel. It's not
used?
how much responsibility I feel. It's how much responsibility I take.
Right.
Right. And I take as much responsibility as I possibly can. Right. Which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Right. I'm going around the world. I'm talking in different cities. I'm talking to people as much as I can. I'm putting out content that I think is useful for people online, and I'm clarifying what I think. I have 300 videos on YouTube. Virtually, for all intents and purposes, every single word I've said to students in a professional capacity since 1992. And despite the fact that I have innumerable, highly motivated enemies, they haven't been able to find one thing I've said in 30 years that, what would you say, justifies any of those accusations, or any other accusations for that matter. So it's quite the phenomena. I mean, I understand it to some degree, you know, because...
So, sorry, about the Pepe flag, 'cause you can help me explain this. Why did you pose with it? What were your reasons for doing it? Did people just come up and bring it to you and
Yeah, I was like posing with... I've probably been photographed with, I don't know, 5,000 people in the last 2 years. And, you know, it's one after the other, often in groups of 100, 150 or 200 people. And it's like 15 seconds.
Right.
And they brought this flag. One of them had spoken at the event. They were doing it ironically. They unfurled the flag, and we took a picture, and that was that.
Would you have posed ironically with a hammer and sickle flag?
I don't know under the circumstances what I would have done. I have all sorts of Soviet art in my house.
Right. Because this is, I think, anybody could get caught out, and social embarrassment is a huge factor, and you don't want to kind of tell people who've been very nice to you that actually you don't want to do the thing. I just wonder if that's something that you regret now, that you wouldn't do it again if you had the opportunity.
Well, I don't think it did me any good. I don't think I'll betray my former self. We'll just leave it where it is. I made the decision that I made under the circumstances and took what was there into consideration. I think that the Pepe formulators did a wonderful job of trolling the standard media. I don't think that they were what everyone presumed them to be.
I think they did a wonderful job of trolling you as well, in a sense, right? Recruiting you and your image and your appeal to people to their kind of cause, which is ironic.
I don't really think so.
But is not actually. Underneath it all, I don't find it very ironic, actually.
What don't you find ironic?
That a lot of the kind of 4chan culture, which is saying, I'm just going to say the worst possible thing that I can say just to prove that I can say it because free speech is still alive. I think that in itself is quite poisonous to the discourse. I think I try and conduct myself online in a relatively civilized manner. I do not always succeed, but I do not think just going into a room and screaming epithets is something that I need to do on a daily basis to prove that free speech isn't dead, right?
I think we could probably agree that that's a reasonable
a rare note of consensus. But I have to come back to the free speech idea, because I think that whole idea of the intellectual dark web, and this came up a couple of times at your event on Thursday, is predicated on the idea that you have been marginalised for your opinions or oppressed for your opinions.
It's not predicated on my claim of that.
Right. It's predicated on...
Well, I don't know. I'm not claiming I've been marginalised. I would never use that word, first of all. That's for sure.
So, but the idea of a dark...
I don't feel oppressed.
Good. I'm pleased to hear it. But I do think that the way that you got the cheers from that crowd was very much about... There was an idea of taboo breaking, right? That this is a microaggression, but I'm going to say it anyway, that, hard work is the way to succeed. And I thought that was fascinating, because to me you don't look like somebody who has particularly suffered an outrageous amount for your opinions. People have certainly disagreed. They've been rude. They've in some cases...
The only reason I haven't suffered an outrageous amount for my opinions is because I've handled the consequence of their utterance exceptionally well. My job was at risk. My career was at risk. My family stability was at risk. So I wouldn't push that one too far.
In what way was your job at risk?
Jesus. Last year, 200 of my fellow faculty members signed a petition to get me fired. That was only one of a dozen things that happened. The university wrote me 2 cease and desist letters from their HR departments with their legal staff. 3 of those and you're done. They just fired Rick Maida in Canada at Acadia University for talking about many of the same things that I've talked about. So the fact that I've come through this relatively unscathed has very little to do with the vitriol of the attacks. There was plenty of motivation to take me out. It just didn't work.
Right. And I think the fact that it didn't work, to me, makes me ultimately optimistic about where we are, because
Why?
Because I went on, I did a panel a while ago with Zarganara, a Burmese comedian, who was imprisoned for making a joke, right? And we are not yet at that stage. I think, undoubtedly,
We're not. We're damn close.
Really?
How about the guy with the pug in the UK?
Count Dankula.
That's the one.
Right, but he did actually, I mean, that
was a joke. You might not have liked it. I didn't say it was a good joke. I didn't say it was an appropriate joke. I didn't say any of that. I didn't say it was a well thought through joke. But it was a joke.
Yeah, I just fundamentally don't believe that it was a joke. I believe that it was camouflaged as a joke, and that's what it kind of comes across.
Right.
And
Well, that's exactly what you would believe if you were inclined to persecute comedians.
No, I'm not inclined to persecute someone.
Well, you're inclined to persecute him.
I don't think he's a comedian, and I don't think I would have to go and look at the circumstances of that case. But I think
he didn't like his girlfriend's pug and thought he would teach it to do something reprehensible as a joke.
Right, but I see you getting involved, say, tweeting Douglas Murray's article about Tommy Robinson, and I think you see that as a free speech issue, and that's not how I see Tommy Robinson's case at all. I see that as contempt of court, someone who endangered a grooming trial. How do you see that case?
I see it as very fortunate that Tommy Robinson didn't die in prison.
I think I would say that about a lot of people in prison. I think it's very hard to be in prison if you are a sex offender, for example. I think our British prisons are less inhumane than American prisons, but they are still brutal places to be. However, I do think that was an appropriate punishment for somebody who tried to collapse a grooming trial.
Well,
but are you a prison abolitionist?
No.
Oh, right, okay. So you do believe that some people, there are offences for which people need to go to prison?
Why would you ask me a question like that?
Well,
Do I look like someone who isn't interested in meting out appropriate punishment?
No, but I just thought maybe I've made an assumption about you. And I didn't want to make an assumption about you. I'm just going to end with a quick fire round. So I know that this is YouTube, so we have been able to talk for a really long time, but I just want quick answers from you. Who is your favourite author?
Dostoevsky.
Who's your favourite female author?
Margaret Lawrence, I think.
I don't know her.
She's a Canadian author. Kind of an antidote to Margaret Atwood, in my estimation.
Okay. When did you last cry?
Oh, God, who knows? Last week, probably.
Who is your smartest opponent?
Sam Harris is pretty smart.
Because you've had debates about atheism with him and about rationality. And
yeah, I don't really regard him exactly as an opponent. You know, I mean, we disagree on things. I don't really tend to think of people as opponents, generally. I mean, but Harris is smart. He's good at making his case, and so that's been interesting.
What big question don't you know the answer to?
What big question don't I know the answer to? Oh, God, that's a tough one. There's so many of them. Well, personally, it's what I should do in 2 years.
When did you last change your mind about something important?
I'm changing my mind about things all the time.
But
Every time I do a lecture, I change my mind about something.
But something important, something big.
Oh, well, I can tell you. I mean, one thing I've learned in the last 2 years is that I think I overestimated. There's an obesity epidemic in North America, perhaps throughout the Western world. I think I overestimated the degree to which that was a consequence.
Just wondering if I've got enough health
to
do this last guy.
And
if I shouldn't just return back to the inn
I think much more
and try and get to this point with full health.
Well, those are two different things, though, aren't they? Discipline is self-control, and illness is something out of your control.
Well, let's say you're overweight. You should exercise. It's like, well, actually, the evidence that exercise will thin you down isn't that great. And maybe the reason that you're not exercising is because you're ill, not that you're ill because you're not exercising. So I have a lot more sympathy for the hypothesis that the obesity epidemic is actually a consequence of an illness, of a broad scale illness isn't exactly right. It's a dietary problem, fundamentally. And there are deep causes for that.
Are you still eating your all-beef diet?
Unfortunately, yes.
Really, just beef? Not? Can you have, like, ketchup on it?
Nothing. Right. Yes, I wouldn't. It isn't something I would lightly recommend. It's a little hard on your social life. Makes traveling quite difficult, and it's dull as hell. But
what has it done for you?
Well, I lost 50 pounds in 7 months. I stopped snoring. I had some autoimmune conditions that seem to have gone away. I'm not taking antidepressants. My mood isn't perfectly regulated, but I'm under a fair bit of stress, so that might have something to do with it. I sleep much less. I can work more.
Imagine your arteries
GERDs.
might not be in
I don't
great shape.
I don't think there's any evidence that I don't think we have any idea what causes arteriosclerosis. I think all of the dietary knowledge we have is rubbish. And partly because it's unbelievably difficult to do proper dietary studies. You can't do controlled studies. It's all correlational, and there's so many variables. I think the correlational studies are useless. So also this all-meat diet, this all-beef diet has apparently cured my daughter. So,
who had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis?
Well, that was the original diagnosis. Then it was idiopathic, which means we don't know what the hell's causing it. Yeah, but she's completely symptom-free. So that sort of thing makes you sit up and take notice because it doesn't make any sense.
When was the last time you lied? Because the book says no lying. Do you still lie?
Everybody lies.
As Dr. House himself told us. What is most important?
But I'm pretty damn careful about it.
What is most important to you in life?
Not being stupid.
How would your life...
Not making foolish mistakes. Not being incautious. Yeah.
That's tough on yourself.
Life's tough, man.
Right. How would your life have been different if you'd been born female?
Multiple orgasms.
It's not a bad one. What's your biggest regret?
That I didn't take advantage of the opportunity to learn to play the organ when I was 7.
If that's your biggest regret, that's going to be a great deathbed, because that's...
Yeah, well, I would have liked... It would have been better for me if I would have been a better musician.
And finally, how would you like to be remembered?
As someone honest.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you very much.
I'm speaking today with Milo Yiannopoulos. Milo is a hard man to categorize. Part journalist, part performance artist, part agent provocateur, part comedian at wit and wit. Yiannopoulos is a man of immense and complex self-contradiction. He's half Greek and half Irish, but is known as an Englishman to the Americans with whom he has communicated extensively. He's gay and Jewish by descent. He married his long-term boyfriend, an African-American man in Hawaii in 2017, but faces frequent accusations of racism. He is, or was, strangely attractive to young American Republicans and completed a successful and controversy-ridden tour of U.S. universities in 2016 and 2017. For at least 2 years, he was one of the most well-known internet celebrities, let's say, on the political front, caused more uproar than any other single person that I can think of. He collected his fair share of enemies along the way. He's often accused, for example, of being an alt-right supporter, an accusation justified in the view of those who oppose him by his association with Breitbart, for whom he was an editor. In my view, for what it's worth, Milo was such a figure of inner contradiction and outer controversy that I believed from the beginning that his time was numbered. Nonetheless, the circumstances of his demise were unpredictable, I would say, and that's in keeping with his apparent destiny. After revealing details of his early sexual experiences at the hands of a 29-year-old priest whom he refused to name, he stated that he was an active participant in the events and that such occurrences were far more common and far more consensual than people were willing to admit. I don't think he ever recovered from the controversy that those comments generated. I should finish by saying that Milo is definitely now on the list of those who no one acceptably socially should ever speak
that was
to,
hard.
which I suppose is one of the reasons why I'm talking to him.
Oh, he's not going to transform
I want to know what happened to
into
him,
another
his own
monster, is
words,
he?
and I don't really
Awesome.
give a damn if that's politically incorrect. Thanks,
no.
Milo, for agreeing to be on my channel and podcast.
I don't have enough health if there's another
Thank you very
monster.
much for having me. I take a slightly less fatalistic view of my prospects than your introduction would suggest. But certainly I went through an extraordinary tumble, and I'm happy to share my thoughts about it with you.
Yeah, well, let's start by reviewing some of your history, if you wouldn't mind. Mm-hmm. Tell me. Let's start with a bit of your history in the UK before you came to the US. It's been long enough so that I think some biographical information would be useful for people. So, tell me about your life in the UK before you came to the US. And then let's start talking about what happened to you as soon as you came over to North America.
Sure. I had a very unhappy life, particularly a very unhappy 20s in London. I started off as a journalist in some quite prestigious publications. I was in a relationship that was, I don't think, healthy or happy for either person involved. I was searching, I think. I was looking. I couldn't work out yet what I was for, what my purpose was. And it wasn't until I got to America I discovered what it was. But I started to explore at least what would eventually become my, I suppose, my civic function as bomb thrower and provocateur. Right at the beginning of my career in journalism, I mean, I was fairly predictably come from a broken home, not much love for or from either parent. And I got lucky, combination, I guess, of luck and talent, writing for the Telegraph, which is the most prestigious newspaper in Britain. And I began to notice the gap between the world that I was being asked to describe and the world that I could see existed. And at the time, I was writing about technology. I was being asked to say that women were having a dreadful time of it in the emerging startup ecosystem in London, which, as far as I could tell, was the exact opposite of the truth. And eventually, these sort of fissures got wider and wider to the point where I sort of had this moment where I realized that my profession was a crock of you know what, and that if I wanted to do something worthwhile with my life, I should either blow it up from the inside by being one or pick something else to do. And that was around the time that I attracted the attention of Breitbart, the site in the US. And I started from London writing from Breitbart in the US. And at that time, I didn't really know what it was. I never met Andrew Breitbart, and I didn't know who he was either.
Yeah, I don't think anybody knew what it was or what it was to begin with. And it's a funny thing when you look at things in retrospect. You know, you get involved with people and organizations that develop a particular way over time, and then it looks, from a historical perspective, like that was self-evident from the beginning, but certainly not when you're dealing with a new organization.
Yeah, I mean, it was new-ish. I don't think that the values of Breitbart changed a lot, but I think perhaps its modus operandi, I think perhaps the way that it conducted itself as an organization shifted into high gear when Steve Bannon and I were there. And I was doing the culture war stuff, and Steve was using the rest of the site as a sort of battering ram politically. So, I mean, I bear a large part of the responsibility for Breitbart becoming what it eventually became, although I don't think they've held on to that legacy very well. I think it's a little sad the way that they're sort of, when I was there, we used to make the news, and now they're sort of chasing after Turning Point, you know, with stories that could have been written in 2015, 16. I don't think they've managed to maintain the culturally defining excitement that was there when I was there, which I think is a function of me and Steve working together. I suppose my center of gravity just started shifting to the US. I started getting invitations to go and speak at colleges, and sooner or later, one day I just sort of thought that there were 6 of them in a row, so I thought there was no point flying home between them. I may as well just stay and just do sort of college after college. And then suddenly I found myself booking more of them and wondering why I should bother going home. And my center of gravity editorially and in other ways was shifting to the US too. So I, over the course of 6 or 9 months, began writing more about the States, thinking more about the States, being in it, talking about it. And then I suppose fast forward a year perhaps, and I was one of the 2 or 3 people driving, Breitbart as this extraordinary, momentous, fascinating, dysfunctional editorial force through the last election.
So what was it that attracted you, do you think, to the United States and the political concerns there? Why away from the UK?
I don't think Britain handles iconoclasts very well, and it particularly doesn't handle bombastic ones. And I think a lot of people with outsized personalities find themselves investigating America as an alternative birth, because I think America has a much higher tolerance for outsized personalities.
Yeah, well, it's pretty clear that you had some of the characteristics that make people stars, that make people personalities. That was obvious pretty much from the step of the first.
Well, this is why I'm not worried in the long term about my career prospects. I had a stratospheric rise over a couple of years and, a painful tumble. But talent is talent, and talent always wins. And I've got 40 years ahead of me, of whatever I choose to do with it. So I'm not worried in the long term about my career prospects at all.
Good. Well, we can talk about your descent and the sort of catastrophe that accompanied it, and maybe about how you see yourself how you see being pulled out of that. I'd like to hear about that as well. Mm-hmm. So what in the world do you think made you so attractive to American Republicans? I mean, this is one of the things that struck me about you right from the beginning, because it's not exactly like you're a poster boy for what you would assume conservative American Republicans would be attracted to. So,
I think they quite liked the fact that I was reflecting their views in a package that you would more often think would be a liberal. And of course I, made that part of the act and part of the brand. It's kind of like, all these things and yet still a Republican. But the real answer is joy. There's a joylessness about a lot of conservative activist authors and speakers. And there's a joylessness in the intellectual dark web too. It's a very funless place. And I look out at the public intellectuals and commentators and speakers who are currently enjoying a moment in the sun, and each of them is in their own way quite joyless, quite devoid of mirth. And I think that people liked my sense of mischief and they liked the fact that I was always smiling. And I think it's unusual to see somebody talking about really serious things who is the subject of the most extraordinary and relentless abuse, who nonetheless is always smiling. And I have always been that person. I've never stopped, not in 2017, 18, or today. And I think people find that very mesmerizing and very attractive because...
And very perplexing and difficult to understand, given the circumstances and the apparent seriousness of the topics. There is something to be said.
Because I think it's to do with... joy is Christianity's great gift to Western civilization. Laughter, the medieval church is, this place of song and of dance. I think Christianity has become quite joyless. The only places where there's a really impassioned, happy spirit of worship is in black churches. But white evangelical Protestantism in the US has become, I think, quite suffocating and joyless. I think the public square as a whole, in general, is a miserable place.
Yeah.
Twitter is a miserable place. If you turn the television on, people are miserable. I think there's something about me, there's something maybe missing in my brain that doesn't get ground down by it. And I'm watching, I had my, moment in the sun. Some other people are having a moment in the sun now. That will, that too will pass. And I'm watching them, and I'm watching them all getting ground down.
Well, that's a real question. It's of interest to me from a psychological perspective. I mean, my suspicions, it's obviously that you're extremely extroverted. I'm not claiming any particular brilliance for noting that. And also that you're extremely open, and that's the creativity dimension. But I'm wondering about your scores on neuroticism. It's like you were subject to a tremendous amount of controversy and then quite a precipitous fall under strange and complicated circumstances, and you seem to be able to survive that. And you just described yourself as a relatively joyful person. I mean,
I'm a very happy person. I think that, listen, I mean, the conservatives are only out and off the playing field when they choose to be, because there's so few of us in such a wide open market. The reason I'm not worried about my prospects in the long term is I still wake up every day with joy in my heart, brimming with energy and ideas. I don't know anybody in public life, not one person in public life, who could have gone through what I went through and not been broken by it. But I'm not. It hasn't beaten me. And I think that's down to a combination of personal characteristics that I don't think many other people possess. And that's part of that is, not being, it's impossible to intimidate me, for instance. I don't get scared of things. I'm not scared of people. I don't feel, perhaps to the same degree that other people do, embarrassment and shame. So I don't mind playing the fool, playing Falstaff, clowning. I don't mind subverting myself, laughing at myself, because through that I'm able to point to truths that are real and big and beautiful and important. I'm not an egotist, so I don't, and I think that's part of the same thing. I don't mind humbling myself because I play at having a big ego, but I don't really. And I'm not ground down or broken or upset by things that, that don't matter that much. I mean, I have love in my life. I have achieved more than 99.8% of journalists, political activists, public figures. You and I are the only people who have achieved remotely close to our level of success in our, in the last 10 years worth of libertarian, conservative, IDW, whatever this grand nexus ecosystem is that we both belong to. You and I are the only two people who, you and I are the two who have achieved the greatest success at it. And I've had terrible things happen to me. You're fortunate and nothing bad has really happened to you yet. I can't think of anything really awful that's happened to you aside from the Cambridge thing, which I think that
I wouldn't call that.
Well, I think you brought that on yourself, and I don't think it was. I think you brought that on yourself, and I don't think it was too much of a big deal anyway. But nothing really bad has happened to you yet. The worst thing imaginable has happened to me. I had to stand up in front of the world and tell them that I had been sexually abused as a child, and that this was why I'd spoken loosely and incautiously and used a formulation that I regretted about something that had happened to me. And at the same time, try to also say, well, I'm not going to stop making jokes about that or anything else. For other people, I think that level of public ritual humiliation would simply have snapped them. And it didn't me. And I don't know, I mean, you're the psychology expert. Perhaps you have some insight of view on this. The only person I know in my personal life, a friend who has similar qualities, is Ann Coulter, to whom criticism it's a game. And she's able to and the interesting thing is, it's not enough to say that we're, let's say, sociopathic, because quite clearly we're both not. We wouldn't be able to have some of the insights we do, and we wouldn't have the love in our lives that we do if we were sociopathic. So it's not that. But we do both have an ability to just pick things up, put them over there, and not allow them to to burrow in and have and create.
Yeah, well, that seems to me to be that relatively rare combination of extreme extroversion and very low neuroticism. That's not the same as sociopathy.
I think you're right about that. I think maybe that's what I've got.
Some people are just not that affected emotionally by negative events. You know, and some people are devastated by the smallest of obstacles, and some people can roll with punches that would take a normal person out and continue to get back up. And it certainly seems that
things do bother me in my personal life, but they're things that are actually significant, whether it's to do with my family or, you know, my loved one or whatever it is. There are things that that in my brain are emotionally significant, serious things, worthy of unfettered access to my emotions, if you like. Mm-hmm. And they have that. And they produce very strong reactions in both directions. I'm a very passionate person. I can even be hot-headed, you know, when I'm defending somebody I love, for instance. But there's another world, which is the professional world, which is, to me, just a big game. It's a big, fun game. And the reason
this is why I've always thought of you as a kind of a trickster. You know, I mean,
I think that's part of it.
In the sense that you do, there is a game-like element to what you're doing. And
I very much see what I'm doing in life and will be doing for the next 40 years as playing a very complex and very enjoyable game of a game of snakes and ladders. And just because I hit a ladder on one of my first turns and then immediately the snake took me back to the front row, it doesn't mean the game is over. In fact, it just means you've learned the rules. So that's, I suppose, why I find it difficult to take too seriously, you know, harrowing introspection about, you know, whatever, because it's not how I apprehend the situation. I can look dispassionately at what happened and why, and we can talk about that, and I have some ideas about that. But I don't have a sort of emotional, I don't have anything to offload about it, really.
Okay, well, so, you know, when that conversation about your early childhood sexual experiences first came out, I listened to it and I thought that there was tremendous trouble brewing there, you know, for a variety of reasons. And if you remember, I phoned you at that point and suggested that we had a conversation, and we made some efforts to manage that never came to fruition. And I always felt that was unfortunate. And so I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you about that situation, because, you know, I had a lot of mixed feelings about what you said, like many people, and they weren't particularly judgmental, by the way. I mean, so you correct me if I'm wrong here, because I want to get this story straight. Mm-hmm. You related some experiences you had with a priest who was twice your age, right?
Something like that.
Yeah, approximately that. You were about 14.
I think he was a little older than that, actually.
Okay, he was a little older than that.
It's difficult to judge ages when you are 14. I think I thought that he was younger than he was at the time, and subsequently found out he was perhaps 10 years older than I thought he was. It's difficult. Okay. So,
but there was a
significant
age gap. Yeah, and so arguably, he was someone who was in a position of authority, and that what he did with you was something that he shouldn't have done. And also, it's highly probable, given the nature of such things, that you were by no means his only, let's say, target. Mm-hmm. Now, when I heard you talk about that, the first thing that struck me about the way that you formulated it was your refusal to play victim. And I actually found
I didn't see myself as one.
I know that. And that actually struck me as rather admirable, because you came forward and said, this is an uncomfortable truth, but, you know, I was of sufficient age to have a mind of my own, and this was something I was pursuing of my own volition. And then
it is how I felt at the time. And
right.
You know, when you talk about the abuse of authority or whatever, I've never met an authority I recognize or respect. You know, people have to earn my respect. I have never encountered a person in a position of responsibility or authority who I have respected and and deferred to merely by virtue of their office or their position.
Right. So it's
I sort of constitutionally don't recognize authority. So that element of it did not strike me until someone told me.
Okay. Well, that's the thing. Okay. So, well, I can imagine that, because I don't imagine that you were much different in some sense when you were 14 than you are now. Apart from obvious maturation, you're a assertive and provocative person, and you're an iconoclast, and I can certainly see that intrinsic respect for authority, which so oddly often characterizes conservatives, by the way, is quite absent in you. And so, and I thought,
thing, isn't it? Because we have that's the tabloid gadfly constantly taking pot shots at the institutions that you also secretly love and are grateful for, but you are dedicated to keeping them on the ground and not, it's the difference between, the British tabloids, which love to torment our Prime Minister, and the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where journalists are seeking to participate in that prestige rather than bring these people down to earth and make sure they never go a full day taking themselves too seriously. So I think that's perhaps a bit of the British psyche working.
Right. That seems, given my interactions with British journalists, that seems like a perfectly appropriate statement. Now, despite the fact that when I heard you speak about what happened to you and my admiration for your refusal to play innocent victim, I also had contradictory ideas that I think were more a function of my clinical training. And there were two of them that I'd like to discuss with you. I mean, the first is, when you think about yourself as a 14-year-old, you think about that 14-year-old as yourself. You don't necessarily think about that 14-year-old as a 14-year-old. And, when you remember your 14-year-old self, and then you go out and you see some 14-year-olds, it's actually quite a shock, or it can be quite a shock, because 14-year-olds are often a lot younger and a lot more clueless
than you
remember yourself being.
I think I know where you're going with this, and I.
Well, and so.
Go ahead.
Well, because the second part of what I thought was that, and this is the incredibly tricky part of this conversation, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, one of the other things that got you in real trouble, apart from the fact that you wouldn't name the person that you interacted with, your abuser, so to speak, was that you made the unforgivable case, I think, publicly, that this sort of thing happened far more commonly than people were willing to admit. And as soon as you said that, I thought, man, you're dead in the water. Because
it was interesting watching. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, true that may be, it's not something that can be publicly discussed. It's not. I want you to again tell.
I went a bit further though than just that. I took it a step further even, and said that not only is this something that happens far more often than people are willing to admit, it is a function of gay life and gay adolescence, blossoming, whatever, and it is a proper subject for humor. And I insist on it being a proper subject.
Yeah, well, I wasn't even going to bring those two things up, because I thought that just, that merely bringing up the first part of that would cause enough trouble. But I'm glad that you did bring the second part of that up. Well, because there's a serious conversation that has to be had about this, and the damn conversation hasn't happened. And I don't mean specifically about your particular experience, although I think it's a way into the conversation. It's like, the first question is, well, it'd be interesting to take apart some of your claims, and I'd like to do that with your permission. And I don't expect this to be an easy conversation.
No, I wasn't expecting it to be, so go ahead.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is that it isn't obvious to me that even if you were a willing participant in what happened to you when you were 14, that justifies what happened to you on the part of the person with whom you were participating.
Well, no, of course it doesn't. But the way I apprehended it was that it was me.
Right.
And when I said a moment ago, I think I know where you're going with this. I can interject with a very small data point that I think explains how I think about this after some time and reflection, which is I have something now that I didn't have in 2017, which is a relationship.
This in-boss is harder than the bosses in Cuphead or not? Because this is pretty tricky.
He is 16. And when I think... Let's not finish that thought. But when I consider how old he is and put myself at that age, suddenly the horror that I see in everybody else's faces that I have never felt myself about what happened to me, and therefore has never been communicated from me, a sort of acknowledgement and awareness that this is not normal, and that this is a horrifying and terrible thing to happen to a small person. I never apprehended it like that because I just thought of that 14-year-old as me today.
Right. Okay, and that's exactly what I picked. Look, that's exactly what I picked up from your interview.
Until the last 2 years, okay, and now I'm experiencing getting to know a child.
Yeah. As
a co-parent. Yeah. As a stepmom, and now I get it.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I've seen this with my clinical clients, who failed to notice in some important way that the person they were sometimes decades ago is not the person they are now. And the memories they have from those times, which are appropriate to those times, are not the same memories that are appropriate to those times now, given their relative maturation.
I think that's fair. And I think it took that change in my life circumstances for me to jolt me into realizing exactly what you're saying.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions about that. So, what's changed in the way that you view what happened to you? And if you were interviewed, well, and I guess you are being interviewed about this right now. If you were being interviewed about what happened to you at age 14, I have 3 questions about that. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the propriety of that? How do you now view your role? And what do you think about the culpability of the person that I would say, in common parlance, preyed upon you? How has that shifted?
In the same way that there is, although it has been ruined by the progressives we both hate so much, a proper place for outrage. It is a necessary and right human instinct and emotion that has a place. There is also perhaps, much as it has been ruined by the progressives, a proper place for victimhood, when you are in fact actually a victim.
Right.
And I think that now I perhaps realize that I was one when I didn't know that I was one in 2017.
Yeah, well, that's a hell of a thing for someone in your position to admit.
Right.
No, it's rough, man.
And I think that that's as concise and as true an answer as I can give you. And I think
so let's go into that a little bit.
The answer, because now I look at somebody I care about who is 2 years older even. And the thought of me at that age and someone taking advantage, suddenly I get it. I'm like, I would kill the guy. I would walk over there. I would shoot him in the head. Like, I get it now.
Okay, so that's a lot different. That's a lot different.
I didn't get it when I didn't get it when all I had to go on was my memories of being me at the time.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that struck me as so absolutely absurd about what happened to you in the aftermath of that interview was that I thought, okay, this is really, and it's exactly what I would have expected to happen to someone like you, because you're so contradictory, is that you actually had a claim to victim status, which you then refused to capitalize on. And then which people refused to bloody well recognize in the midst of the interview. Like, the proper response to that interview should have been something like, well, here's someone who's talking about a case of child sexual abuse, but hasn't realized or recognized that they were, in fact, victimized in that situation and hasn't come to terms with whatever that might mean. And
this
so then
is not uncommon among people who have been through these experiences, because I have, since writing about this, I wrote a little bit about this in a short book I wrote about the Pope recently. And in the other things the brief mentions I've made of it since 2017, a lot of people have written to me with their own accounts. Mm-hmm. And this is not uncommon. I have
I'm sure it's not.
Who have experienced this sort of thing. And I guess there's some point in middle age where the penny drops. But yeah, I guess that there is a right and proper place to acknowledge and understand that you were a victim of something. Again, another thing that upset people, I think, another thing that didn't do many favors. But look, I am someone who will always just speak it as I see it, and that will have terrible consequences and it will have great consequences, and and that calculus will change over the course of the next few decades. But I just it wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me, and people find that a terrible thing to come out of your mouth, but it just wasn't. It's not the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And
so what's the worst thing? Okay, so I got a couple of comments on that. I mean, about 20 years ago, the American Psychological Association published a famous paper showing that most people who were sexually abused as children recovered with very little psychological damage. And that caused absolute outrage. The U.S. Congress, in fact, forced the APA, if I remember correctly, the American Psychological Association.
This is one of those unsayable truths, isn't it?
Well, they had to retract the article, even though
if you imagine the sort of trauma that we're expected to recognize that someone says they experience because of mean words on the internet, and we have this economy based on what we all know is not true, but that these trivial, frivolous things can cause some kind of actual trauma. For an organization like that, or for someone in public life to come out and say this huge thing actually didn't cause me that much trauma, mm-hmm. It sort of imperils the whole victimhood economy, doesn't it? Because if it's the case that many or even most people who experience this simply don't have their lives ruined and defined by it, that rather imperils the people who have made a career out of squawking victimhood for far, far less serious experiences. And I think that's probably where the threat to the system kicked in.
I think that's true. I think it's also the case that the politicians, although also looking for a cheap victory, moral victory in some sense, were also concerned that this was a potential step towards justifying pedophilia on the basis of undermining the claims of its absolutely catastrophic consequences over decades. Whereas what I saw it was more as a testament to the fundamental resilience of human beings.
Right. Isn't that a positive thing? Isn't that wonderful news? That there are these extraordinarily evil people who do depraved things, but that chances are you'll be all right. That something like this could happen to you, or could happen to somebody you love or somebody you know, but that, what? Chances are things will be okay. Mm-hmm. Now, every once in a while, somebody is just blown apart by it and you can never put them back together. But that's not most people. That's fabulous news. But good news is the sort of thing that our current political climate, the public square in America, especially hates. It's not so much whether it's a particular kind of reaction to, for instance, people being grateful and happy that capitalism is lifting millions of people out of poverty all over the world. People don't like that good news,
right?
Because much of what goes on in public life, basically the whole journalism industry, much of the entertainment industry. I mean, the whole of polite society, the whole of politically correct society depends upon everything being terrible, in peril, getting worse all the time. The sort of shrieking, urgent hysteria of the press is made to look ridiculous when you point out actually the world's pretty great. Not that many people go hungry. Not that much bad stuff happens. The bad stuff that does happen, we're discovering all the time that human beings bounce back in ways that, you know, we never even imagined. Like, the world ain't that bloody bad. Nobody wants to hear that who has a vested interest.
Or if at least if it isn't at least it's nowhere near as bad as it once was, which is something.
Or as bad as it profits the media to suggest that it is, as bad as it profits the academy to suggest that it is. You know, these people having relinquished their primary functions, whether it is, you know, speaking truth to power and you know, printing all the news that, you know, relaying the news that's fit to print, or exploring the human condition, human nature, and, you know, building the, you know, expanding the, you know, the horizons and the sum total of human knowledge. The media and the academy have given up on those missions. Instead, replaced them with an activism that depends on hysteria, but also on urgency. On a sort of, there's a sort of constant drumbeat. And this is why, you know, it's always something new, always something new, always something new. As soon as something might look like it's resolved, something ever more hysterical and new must be produced. This is the natural life cycle, isn't it, of rights movements. You've got the gay rights movement, which basically achieves everything it could possibly ever want, yet it somehow becomes more hysterical, not less, and starts focusing on ever more minor and insignificant things like transgender pronouns rather than AIDS. You know, and now all of the gay charities are run by lesbians and are preoccupied with transgender pronouns. You don't hear anybody talking about the fact that thanks to, you know, you see these posters on New York trams on the subway, whatever they're called, and they're saying, there's a guy there and he's called Hernandez or Hernando or whatever, and his and the poster is saying his levels of HIV thanks to his medication aren't just undetectable, they're not transmittable either. Basically encouraging gay men to have sex with HIV positive other men. Yeah. I mean, this kind of like sick. This is because conservatives have completely stepped out of that sphere entirely. Every time a conservative tries to say something in the gay world, even if it's with good intentions to help, they get killed. So Republicans and even just all sensible people have simply stepped out of LGBT stuff, and they just don't get involved in it at all. So you get this sick, crazy, like mental. So with this, you know, this situation where they're encouraging these reckless, unsafe, horrendous behaviors, and who suffers? The most marginalized communities of all. You know, it's a gay Black Americans have like a 1 in 2 chance of getting HIV. You know? Right. Like that's crazy. And this is, you know, and this is what gay charities are not talking about, while they are insisting that, you know, on Ziza, Zem, or whatever. But this is the life cycle of rights movements when they run out of things to complain about, isn't it?
Okay, so let me ask you another personal question. Before I turn to something that will probably get me even more in trouble. We'll see how that goes.
Well, you've subjected me to a therapy session. I think you can get yourself into trouble as compensation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there should be plenty of trouble emerge from this. So, well, look now. One of the questions I had, again, as a consequence of watching that interview, was because, you know, you portrayed yourself as an equivalent partner in some sense, and I thought, look, that means that Milo hasn't updated his memories. Mm-hmm. They're still the memories of a 14-year-old, and that's a problem. And so you said that that's something that you've actually rectified over the last couple of years, and so that's a very interesting thing to hear about. But then I was also convinced that because you were still viewing what had happened to you through the lens of your 14-year-old, your iconoclastic and rebellious 14-year-old self, mm-hmm. that it was possible, likely even, although not necessarily the case, that you underestimated the consequence of this interaction on your subsequent life. And so now you just told me that, you know, yes, much worse things have happened to you. But
yes, and you might be right about that, because in 2017, that's what I thought. And then in the course of writing the short Pope book I just did, I asked the question, could this have affected the trajectory of my sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, well, I wonder. Of course it could. Exactly. Well, so what? In retrospect now, what do you think it did to you?
I don't think it made the difference between me being gay or not.
Okay. And why not?
Because I think that was already happening. And I think that I was aware of that, and that was very much, some gay people talk about, being a little bit over into gay or a lot or whatever. Some gay men can countenance or imagine having sex with women. And for others, it's just like, in the way that straight men will talk about homosexual encounters. Now, I have had a few encounters with women, but they were very unsatisfying and miserable for both parties. And I think I'm quite... I don't... My hunch is, and I can't provide any evidence, but my hunch is that this did not make the difference.
Okay.
I think that, like everybody, the mixture of nature and nurture in my case was probably swung over in that direction by a lack of good male role models in my relationship with my mother. I distinctly remember picking ethnic minority male sexual partners and making sure that my mother saw me bring them home or saw me out with them to antagonize her. I distinctly remember picking sexual partners to annoy my mom, and that, as demented as that sounds, and
God, that's a grist. I mean, like a 3-hour conversation.
No, look, I take trolling very seriously. I'm not saying that I went gay to annoy my mum, although I have made that joke before, but I remember an element of sort of mischief and defiance in there, which has always been at the core of my personality. Just this reflexive and unshakable refusal to bow to any kind of authority.
Right.
And
so what were you
more than that also, but not just to thumb my nose at it, but to rub that authority's face in whatever it is that authority finds the most repugnant.
Okay, well, so that's interesting. So first question there would be, perhaps, what in the world were you so irritated or angry at your mother about that might have been one of your potential reactions?
I have said this
coffee
before, so I don't mind sharing it with you again. My mother remarried, and her new husband was occasionally physically and constantly psychologically, abusive, I guess, is the word that we would use now. A deeply unpleasant home life. In things like, so I was a very private kid, and I had all of these papers where I had written out poems and constructed these systems, and I just had a very highly developed inner world, and I just lived in the realm of imagination and fantasy, and private space and privacy was very important to me. And my mother's new husband, when I was at school, would go into my room and shuffle things around just so that I knew he'd been in there. So I knew that there was no space that was only mine. And I knew by extension that I wasn't welcome there, and that I shouldn't be there, and that so long as I was under his roof, I would never be my own human being. And I would never have my own privacy and therefore autonomy as a human being. And I blamed my mother for this. I also blamed my mother for not leaving him when he hit me. And I blamed my father for not taking me away, although I asked him to. And that sort of began a chain reaction of resentment for both of them.
Right. And so most of the major authority figures in your life as parental figures had, your experience at that point was of betrayal of various various magnitudes. Right.
Yeah, they didn't have my back.
Right.
From proper betrayal all the way down to just not having my best interests at heart, not having my back, and all manner of experiences on that spectrum. But I don't think I ever felt like my mother would go to the wall for me, Right.
That's rough, man, because one of the things you really want from at least one parent or at least one person in your life is the notion that fundamentally, man, you got to have someone who's got your back.
Well, I did get it later. I did get it later in my mid to late teens with my grandmother, as so many oddballs do. They end up skipping a generation and forming a close bond with a grandparent. I did get it from my grandmother, and I got the sort of unconditional love and support that I recognized again in the man that I'm now with. So I have had that since in my life, and I'm not wanting for it. I don't lack it. I'm very happy with the amount of it that I now have, but I didn't.
That's made up for it in some sense.
Oh, for sure. But I didn't have it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember really wanting them to hurt. I remember, and I think one of my, in addition to my ability to sort of see around corners and culturally and sort of tell what's coming next, which I'm very good at, I'm also very good at sort of intuitively figuring out what makes people tick and what drives them. And I quickly identified that social justice warriors were sort of hurting and wanting everyone else to hurt like they were. When I very, very first started doing my speeches, because it was something I had felt myself, but only as a child. I had grown out of it, and clearly they had not grown out of it.
Right.
But I saw in them that same sort of petty, vengeful, vindictive desire to make the world burn because they were hurting, that I had felt myself as a 13, 14, 15-year-old. And so I understood them. And that's why I was able, and still am able, like nobody else, to get under their skin. Because I get what makes them tick in a way that not many other people do. Because none of the other conservatives who are sort of, withering, or contemptuous of them actually understand where they're coming from like I do. Which is why they hate me like they hate nobody else.
Right. Well, because part of the thing that's so strange about you is that by all rights, you should be on their side.
I should be one of them, really.
Right.
I ought to be.
Right. That's right. Logically speaking, that would be your natural resting place. And so it is one of the things that, well, I also thought right from the beginning that was one of the things that put you in terrible long-term danger of, encountering a scandal that would do you in. I mean, it just seems so improbable to me that you could weather that degree of, and that's what I mean by the paradoxical combination that you bring to the situation. It's too many contradictory things to maintain themselves, regardless of your psychological integration or lack thereof.
I mean, I think I'm pretty well adjusted now, but I think perhaps another reason that this career stuff just doesn't bother me is that I don't work in the same economy that a lot of other people do, in the prestige economy. You wanted prestige when you asked Cambridge for that fellowship, and you sort of invited that little embarrassment on yourself because you asked for it, because although you've declared
Well,
war,
they said I asked for it, but that wasn't exactly...
Well, if you didn't, you didn't, but you declared war on a class of institution, a higher education, to then ask for or expect or be pleased to receive baubles from institutions that you had declared war on struck me as very odd and obviously destined for, a mess.
That's an interesting point.
And it's because
a moment of false optimism.
I don't think it's false optimism. I think it's because you still live in the prestige economy, because I think that stuff matters to you. And I think that you'd probably prefer to see these institutions fixed and to have a prestigious place within one of them, rather than to see them burnt to the ground, as so many conservatives and progressives seem to want. They just want to tear up higher education. I don't think you want that. I think you want to fix it, and I think you want to be a crown.
Well, I think generally speaking, that fixing things is better than burning them to the ground.
I think you want to fix them, and I think you want to be one of their crown jewels, and I think you operate in the prestige economy in a way that I simply don't. And that gives me power, because I don't care. I don't, that's sort of like a scandal from which you will not recover. Is there somebody in polite society who will invite me to a dinner party, who won't invite me to a dinner party now, who would have in January 2017? No. Is there a TV show that will have me on, that won't have me on now, but would have in January 2017? No. I mean, I had a blip on Bill Maher because of the college tour. But there was no hope in hell, no way in hell I was ever going to get a TV show or anything like that, because unlike you, I can't bite my tongue. And, you I think are I see you maneuvering in a way that suggests that you want to do a lot of good and you're prepared to make some compromises in order to have a platform from which to do a lot of good in a lot of places. I'm a purist, and we differ in that because I can't bite my tongue. And if I'm across the table from somebody who is an odious piece of, you know what, I'm like, I'm going to tell them. And it's always, it's my greatest asset and my greatest weakness. But it's because I'm a purist in a way that you're not. And I don't live in that prestige economy that the rest of you all live in. And you all live in it. The whole conservative libertarian media ecosystem, you all crave prestige.
Well, what do you mean by the prestige economy exactly?
Position, recognition, titles, being a part of a sort of alternative polite society. You don't want to be excised from the church, because if you did, you wouldn't have signed up with CAA. You want to be part of the church, and I don't. And it can be very difficult for people who are part of the prestige economy, but people who want the TV show, want the fancy agent, want this, want that, and they want to fix and rule these institutions. It can be very difficult for those people to truly understand someone like me who genuinely can't imagine anything worse. I cannot imagine anything more awful than having to make the sorts of constant compromises in what I say and do in order to maintain a position, because I know it's doomed anyway. Look at Roger Scruton. Did nothing wrong. He is beyond reproach. He is, he is the foremost conservative intellectual of his generation. And they just got him for saying something utterly innocuous in an interview. They're going to get you anyway. Nothing bad has happened to you yet, but it's going to. And I don't say that with any pleasure whatsoever. I sincerely do not, because I think.
Well, I've been expecting that for a very long period of time. Well, I'd say many bad things have happened to me. They just haven't taken me out.
Not really. I mean, in compared to what some of us have gone through, whether it's Laura or me or whatever, or Alex Jones or whatever, nothing really bad has happened.
Well, fair enough. Yes.
It
does depend on your comparison group. Well,
they are allowing you to grow. I'll tell you what they're doing with you, what they did with me, which is you allow this phenomenon to blossom up to the point you cannot bear it any longer. And then you crush it. And that is a horrifying warning to others not to overstep. So they did it with me. They let me get as far as Bill Maher and the tour and all the rest of it. And then they came for it. They're letting you climb higher. So your fall is going to be just like mine was, and they'll get you on something else. They'll get you on a complete nothing burger. Because mine, let's face it, was a nothing burger. It was, the supposed scandal was predicated on an edited video which did not show that I said that I thought the age of consent was about right. And it was based on a lie. If it had been the case that everybody had seen what I originally said, they might have said, please explain this, but it would not have had the same effect that it did. It had the effect it did because it was a deceptive, dishonest, misleadingly edited video. Because I had created enemies on both left and right, the establishment right and the whole left teamed up to take me out. You are walking into the same position.
And so why do you see that it was the establishment right? Do you think that
was a hard boss?
They're the ones who did it. It was the Reagan. Well, it was the Reagan Battalion, the National Review crowd.
Oh, it's over.
Put that video together and shared it.
All of their hard work.
To manufacture
and the game's completely over.
That I didn't give a stuff about CPAC because it means nothing to me. I didn't even know what it was at the time. But they were upset that I was speaking at CPAC because it was like their precious pure conservatism thing had been taken over by Trump world. Right. Okay. And they had to. So they didn't care so much about the Bill Maher, but the
life really, isn't it? You can earn and earn and earn, and work and work and work and work as hard as you possibly can, and then at the end of the day,
with this deceptively edited
we all
video,
pass on and die
because they couldn't bear the thought of me being the star turn at CPAC.
Okay, and you think that that's why they pushed so hard on the pedophilia front?
Yes, because they knew it's the one thing that the conservative base would go, yeah.
Right.
And the left didn't take me out. The right did.
Okay. I wasn't aware of that.
No, well...
The left took you out too as well.
what power does the left have over me? What are they doing to me now that they weren't doing in January 2017? Nothing.
Well, I think what my impression, I'm not suggesting that I'm correct, but my impression was that it had something to do with the second of the 2 or 3 topics we were going to discuss, which was your claim that the experiences that you had are actually very characteristic of the gay community. And I thought that was unforgivable.
No, you see, interestingly, what actually happened about that specific thing is the entire gay liberal establishment went silent. Because what I said was...
There's a little bit of an ending.
And I wouldn't phrase it this way again, because it was not quite what I meant, and it was, let's say, incautiously phrased, to put it mildly. What I said was that relationships between older men and younger men, are a common function of gay life. And I think I said after a lot of drinks on a late night live stream, they can be hugely positive experiences. I shouldn't have put it like that. I should have said they are a function of gay life. And in many cases, they're sitting like a 35-year-old man with a 20-year-old or whatever. Very often that 35-year-old will sort of induct the 20-year-old into the gay way of things, show them where the clubs are, show them the ropes, in lieu of parents, because the boy's parents don't understand him, maybe don't even know, or have rejected it or whatever. So very often there's a sort of father, there's either an avuncular or a paternal dimension to these relationships. On that point, and indeed throughout the whole controversy, the gay left went silent. And February 21st, 2nd, and 3rd, 2017, gay journalists were nowhere to be found in America because they did not want to have that discussion because they know it's true.
Okay, well, so was that a consequence of abandoning you by inaction then?
No. What I'm saying is that's not what I'm saying is that's not what was so unforgivable. That wasn't the problem.
Okay, so then, well, in that case, then I guess it's a matter of not so much the difference in age, but the difference in when that age difference starts. So let's say, 34.
So we've had a conversation so far, which has presumed that the contents of what I said was important and that we should dissect it. This is a mistake, because it doesn't matter what I said. It doesn't matter whether I was right to say it or what the nuances or vagaries are of a particular statement that I say is deceptively edited here or whatever. It doesn't matter. Narrative was established, and it was repeated by right and left, and the person was ejected from public life and from whatever, right? This is what's going to happen to you. This is what's going to happen to Ben. This is what's going to happen to Dave Rubin. Because nobody stood up for me, the playbook became established. And now that is your fate, all of you. That's how you're all going to go out. And it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what the subject was. Doesn't matter what the incautious phrase was. I mean, Candace Owens, it could have happened to her recently with her stupid. She tripped over herself saying something about Hitler, and there was a sentence that I'm sure she would phrase differently a second time. Everyone sort of knew what she meant, but it could, if the stars had aligned, have done to her what happened to me in February 2017. The content doesn't matter. It was the fact that the left and right decided to take this person out, and any pretext would have done fine. So we've had a discussion sort of talking about, well, what was it you said that was so unacceptable? Nothing. It was me. It was the fact that I had...
but there's also the mystery. Look, fair enough, and I'm not disputing that there were any number of reasons to make you a target. But I am curious about why it was that particular interview that did it, because it was very sudden.
Because I was scheduled to be the star speaker at CPAC, and the National Review crowd could not handle it. So they went through the hours and hours and hours and hours of old live streams, and they found something that would get to the Republican base. Something they could sell to alienate me from Republicans rather than just the left. And then they decided this person's going to go. This is a power they still have, and it's a power they will leverage against the rest of you too. My question is, we can talk a little about where I'm going to go next and what I'm going to do next professionally, because I think it might help the rest of you when this inevitably happens to you. But this is a power they still have. It is a power that they can and will leverage against other people. And unfortunately, the brightest star and the greatest standard bearer, the court jester of the movement, was allowed to be decapitated. And because that happened, the playbook is now established for it to happen to everybody else. And it will happen to everybody else. It's already happened to other people. You've seen it happen since to others, right?
It happened to Sargon of Akkad.
Exactly.
In a lesser.
This is now how it's going to be, and it didn't have to be like that. The only way that this boycott and defenestration could have been successful would be if Republicans refused to. Would have been if Republicans said, "Okay, we won't invite him to anything. We won't have him on our radio shows. He's too hot to handle. Too much drama. Too much hassle." Right? What the left does is immediately start putting that person on conference stages and panels to get over that period of like, "Ooh, is this person going to become untouchable?" They they drive a truck through that by immediately getting that person on TV and on conference stages a lot to sort of to drive through that and to make sure that person doesn't get removed from circulation, right? That's what the left does. When Linda Sarsour is discovered to have said something awful, suddenly she's on conference stages every 2 days, it seems like. She's speaking in New York, she's doing this. This is not an accident, this is on purpose. This is the left leaping into action to ensure that she survives, right? Conservatives did the opposite with me. They allowed the left and the establishment Republicans who hate them to dictate who would and would not be a proper subject for discussion and who should and should not have, a column and all the rest of it. And that was absolutely suicidal.
Okay.
And the reason that so many other media figures were secretly happy to see it happen to me is that they're idiots who believe that this is a zero-sum game. They think that by removing me, they create space for themselves. This is not true. There is nobody in the conservative or libertarian ecosystem who offers what I do. There's not a single fucking one of you who can crack a good joke. No.
I get the odd good one off on stage. It's not so much on YouTube.
You have your gifts. That's not one of them. Not a single one of you is funny. Not a single one of you could have a late night chat show. That's cabaret comedy like Johnny Carson. None of you. Nobody has filled the void left by me because I'm a once in a generation talent. And sorry to be egotistical, but it is what it is. Nobody has filled that void, which is why I'm not worried about coming back to it and coming out of retirement, and refilling it myself. But something did happen to me, and that's that I sort of gave up on conservatives a little bit. And so when I do return, it's going to be very much more in the mold of a more conventional comedian. And that's what I am currently closing funding to do as we speak down here in Oklahoma. Much more in the vein of an entertainment figure and much, much less of the politics. So the effect...
That might be a relief for you.
Well, not really, because I quite enjoyed it. But the effect of this hasn't been to kill me. The effect of the cowardice of other conservative media figures and the conservative base, their failure to stick up for me in February 2017, the effect wasn't to kill me. The effect was to lose one of their greatest and most effective champions. Because I'm fine. I'm doing good.
Okay, so let's talk about that being fine. So I want to go back to, I still have a question about the older man, younger man relationship issue.
Oh, can't we talk about something else?
Well, humor me for 2 more minutes, because there's actually somewhere I want to go with this.
Okay.
So the first issue is, where's the line properly drawn in those relationships as far as you're concerned with regards to age? and where is it usually drawn? Because those are
now you're trying to get me in trouble.
I'm not. I'm really not. I don't want to get you in trouble.
I don't think there is a line to properly be drawn, because you're basically just talking degrees of degeneracy at that point, aren't you? The fact that you get saddled with this aberrant sexuality and you then have to go out and make the best of it. The fact that you find this paternal or avuncular dimension in a relationship with an older man that may also have a sexual component. I mean, this is layer upon layer upon layer of dysfunction. So you're not going to get me to say 10 years is the right gap, because none of it's the right gap. It's all fucked up.
What's the alternative?
I don't know.
I mean, partly hypothetically,
I wish conversion therapy worked.
Marriage.
I wish conversion therapy worked. At least
you've said that before.
At least in the case of lesbians, we know that we can push women back into back with men, and most of them will be happier as a result. With men, on the other hand, some of us are just gay, and I'm not going to be drawn on what the correct kind of fucked up dysfunctional experience.
First of all, I wasn't trying to corner you, you know. Well, I don't want to corner you. This is something I'm really curious about, because you made the case, and you made a strong case, that relationships between younger men and older men were very common in the gay community. And that seems...
Well, it's not me making the case. That's an established fact. I mean, every gay person knows that. That's got nothing to do with me. That's just me pointing out something that every gay person knows, which is that when people first become sexually active or aware of their sexual orientation, or they first start to go out on the scene or whatever, they very often form an attachment with an older man. It may just be somebody 5 years older. In some cases, it's somebody a little bit older than that.
Fair enough. How often do you think that's happening at the age that it happened to you?
I think it happens all the time. I think it happens everywhere. And I think it's an inevitable result of having an aberrant sexuality, where you have to seek out kind of alternative parental figures, because yours aren't fit for purpose for this particular part of adolescence, you know?
Right, but then you just said too that this isn't an objection, that you don't see a clear ethical pathway forward out of that, you know?
Well, none of it's ethical. I mean, it's all debased and degenerate. But it...
Well, how? What? Okay, so what do you mean by that exactly?
Because I think there's an element of predatoriness in almost every gay interaction and relationship. And this is just one example where it is more obvious and more visible. But I think that there is a predatory component in even in gay friendships. And you think about the way that...
well, that might have something to do with the more predatory element of male sexuality.
Right. And
we're going to talk about undiscussable things.
Right, well, you take the controlling, calming, mediating influence of women out of the equation, and men just hype each other up, which is why gay men end up promiscuous, right? Because you're taking out that
restraint.
Right, exactly. Restraint's the word I was looking for. You're taking out the restraint that's typically provided by the woman. And instead you can just, whatever.
Okay, so hypothetically that was supposed to be solved, at least in part, by the introduction of like socially sanctioned monogamous relationships, right? Because I've had friends, I knew about heightened male promiscuity among the homosexual community, and it's heightened by a substantial margin. And the liberal types, who I thought were reasonable, and I certainly don't think all of them are, made the claim to me that the reason for that enhanced promiscuity was that all the male homosexual sexual activity had to occur behind the scenes, and that it was impossible for men.
That's a ridiculous argument. That's a ridiculous argument. Male homosexual promiscuity is obviously simply a function of what happens when you put two men together attracted to one another, and you don't have the restraint of a woman who would normally go. It's obvious, and also you cannot successfully box a transgressive sexual identity into, what we say, heteropatriarchal institutions like marriage, and expect gay people to just suddenly become, normal, monogamous, whatever. It doesn't work like that.
Well, it seemed to, okay, that's fine. But it seemed to me that in some sense, well, here's something else that is no doubt going to cause trouble. It seemed to me that was kind of part of the bargain. Like, wasn't that the bargain? I
always thought that was part of the deal, is that, in exchange for having this millstone around your neck, in exchange for the terrible agony of giving up fatherhood, which, you can adopt and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, basically, it's like joining the priesthood. You give up fatherhood. In exchange, you get to participate in a sort of taboo-breaking, transgressive, experimental life that performs perhaps some kind of societal function, might even perform an evolutionary function, and which
you have the excitement of the marginal.
Exactly, and that's why I am the world's greatest hypocrite on one subject and one subject only, and that's gay marriage. And that's because I don't have the foggiest idea what I think still, even though I've got one. I'm under no illusions that it is a union under the Lord, but I remain politically against gay marriage, despite the fact that I got one, because I've met somebody who completed me and I couldn't think of anything else to do, but of course I would marry him. So I'm a mess on that subject.
Yeah, that's definitely a mess.
I make no claim to coherent, logical positions on that one subject. That one subject, I'm a mess. But the reason I always was so skeptical of gay marriage is that it was robbing us of the one thing that we had, the one good, cool thing about being gay that you had in exchange for the awful horror of not being able to produce a child with the person you love in the ordinary course of sexual congress. When you realize that, and I don't think a lot of gay people realize that ever, but I realized it quite early, when you realize that, the bottom of your world drops out and you have to do something else. You have to find a purpose. And if your purpose isn't going to be fatherhood, this is why so many gay men join the priesthood, because they want to be a different kind of father. They want to be a shepherd. You have to find some other kind of purpose, and very often for gay men, that's creativity, experimentation.
Yeah.
It's the license that we're given by the rest of society because we don't have this other thing. Trying to cram. Again, I'm a complete hypocrite on this subject because I live in total married bliss. I live in beautiful monogamous domestic harmony. So I'm a 100% hypocrite on this subject. But it still feels to me a shame to sort of condemn, our experimenters. The people who are so overrepresented in artists and musicians and even politicians and warlords, to sort of condemn them to the same, the same monotonous drudgery that you breeders have to submit to.
Yes, well, I can imagine that it sort of grates against your, what would you call it, your anti-authoritarian,
my rebellious spirit and all the rest of it.
Yeah. So you're kind of poetic justice in some sense.
This is one of the many things that convinces me that God is real, because there's a humor in that which could only have come from someone doing it on purpose. Just being you know what? I'm going to give you something that's just going to remind you that you don't know it all, and it's going to confound you for the rest of your life and remind you that you too are messy and complicated. And on this one subject, you are never going to be coherent or logical. Good luck with that.
Okay,
no doubt whatsoever.
I have another terrible question for you. So I read Martel's book on the Catholic Church about homosexuality in the Vatican. And It's a very contentious book, let's say, written by a gay man who claims that homosexuality is extraordinarily common in the Vatican.
It is.
And that the kinds of relationships that you describe between older men and younger men are common in that culture as they're common in the rest of the culture.
Yes, they are. So I've written a book on the subject too, and I can tell you for a fact that both of those things are true. It's called the Lavender Mafia in the Vatican. It is for those viewers who don't know, it is a cabal of not just gay bishops, but specifically progressive left-wing gay bishops,
Yes.
And my book was a little bit more politically focused than his. My book was drawing attention to the fact that the same people who want to water down the liturgy, who want for divorcees to be able to receive communion and want gay people to do whatever, they're the same people who've been covering up child abuse in the church. And it seems that the same people who've been doing the child abuse and covering it up are also the people who are most aggressively pushing for progressive reform of the Catholic liturgy and of Catholic practice. And this, of course, resonates with what we know from other industries, doesn't it? Just like Hollywood, just like the press, just like the academy. The people who are most aggressively pushing for progressive free-for-all sexual liberation are the people with the ugliest and most depraved skeletons in the closet. The rest of us are quite normal. So my book was more about that, but I can tell you that it's absolutely true. The mistake that the Catholic Church has made, and I remain a Catholic despite the terrible state of the Catholic Church.
Yes, and all the other contradictions in your life.
They've never bothered me. They've never scared me. I'm not afraid of that. I'm quite excited by that because I look forward to a day when I might either get closer to a resolution or be happy with not finding one. I can imagine Ben Shapiro would be kept awake at night by this, but I'm not, because I don't need everything in my world to form into a perfect, into like some sort of like Kantian or Wittgensteinian superstructure, where everything has its right place and and everything is perfectly organized and all the dependent things are in the right. That's not what human beings are like. That's not what we are. We're much, much more complex and messy than that. And I'm very much looking forward to 40, 50 years of exploring my own ludicrous, internal nonsense. But I remain a Catholic, but the issue that the Church has had, the mistake that the Church has made, is turning a blind eye, as the Church would put it, to sin.
Interesting thing to research.
And
to hear some podcasts on the lavender cabal from the Vatican.
To be chaste.
I might try and look that up.
And to associate that hypothetically,
the way that
Martel's claim with the proclivity to cover up the child's sexual abuse because of it, which is his most radical claim, I would say.
I don't know if he's wrong about that. What I would say is the way the Church would put it is, if you make room for one sin, others will follow. Right? So what that means in practical terms for the Catholic Church is, because the priesthood is somewhere where lots of gay men go and a blind eye is routinely turned to their sexual peccadillos, even if it's just with each other and there's nothing non-consensual or abusive going on, because it's a sexual free-for-all, because it's the kind of place where supposedly transgressive or forbidden things happen routinely with no consequence, that it becomes an institution that attracts other kinds of people who have other things to hide, like pedophiles. Where are you going to go if you have some kind of psychiatric dysfunction or whatever it is like that? You're going to go somewhere that routinely overlooks or ignores sexual wrongdoing. Of course you are. So that's what the Church, that's what Christians mean when they say, you let one sin and others will follow. They don't just mean it in the sense of personal behavior, like if you let yourself do one thing, you'll let yourself do others. But it also works in institutions too. And of course, lefties will say the reason that all of these problems happen in the Catholic Church is that priests are required to be celibate. The opposite's true. They haven't been celibate for a very long time, and that's what's created the problem. Because there's now an entrenched left-wing gay mafia that effectively runs the Catholic Church, that has engaged in the systematic cover-up of child abuse so as to protect its own power. And that's about as bad as it gets, in terms of, global institutions who have lost their way. That is as bad as it gets. I want a black pope because I want there to be a doctrinally conservative, because all of the Catholics in Africa are like pre-Vatican II. They're serious Catholics, and it will make life very difficult for progressives accusing a black pope from Africa of being a racist and a sexist, because he actually wants Catholic doctrine to remain Catholic doctrine. But the present pope is basically at the head. He is not himself homosexual, as far as we know, but he does sit at the head of this lavender mafia and he is propped up by people like Cormac Murphy O'Connor from England and Wales, Vincent Nichols, and all these other aging 60, 70-year-old liberal cardinals who are products of the 60s, who are soft on communism. And what my book was trying to show was that the soft on communism thing is entwined with the abuse, with the wrongdoing, with everything. They're the same people doing everything. So Theodore McCarrick, who has the distinction of being the world's only ex-cardinal, because Francis had to remove his cardinalcy from him, had to degrade him is the technical term. He was Francis's envoy to China. And he was the one who put the deal together with Francis to allow the Chinese state to participate in the choice, in choosing Catholic bishops. I mean, this hasn't happened since like Gregory VII. The Catholic Church has been ferocious about choosing its own bishops, but they handed selection of the bishops over to the Communist Party in China, knowing that Catholics are routinely persecuted, and killed in China, because they never met a socialist they didn't like. And it's that particular 60, 70-year-old child of the 60s, aging hippie liberal that lives in another planet from the rest of us and is still thinking, if only they... Sorry, there's some lawnmower, Oklahoma. If only socialism were tried one more time, perhaps it would be okay this time. That's the world these people live in, and they also.
That's in your book, Pope.
It's called Diabolical. How Pope Francis betrayed clerical abuse victims like me, and why he has to go. It's called Diabolical. So but anyway, I talk about that in the book. So I'm not here to book, but no, it's very interesting how the same people who are the far leftists, who are pushing for church doctrine to be watered down, which has the effect of emptying the pews. Because when people go to church, they want the fire and brimstone. They go to be told what to do. They want the Bible. They want Jesus. They don't want climate change. Right. They don't, they don't want a bishop talking to them. And I'm not making this up. There are seminaries now where the seminarians are starting to issue. They're starting to give sermons on toxic masculinity. This is a church that has no manly men left in it. Yeah. Every man in that church is a homo. There are no men left in the congregations. There are no heterosexual men left in the clergy. And this is a church that thinks it has a too many men problem. This is a church that, the reason that this subject interested me, in addition to my faith, is that this is another arena in which the loss of manliness and masculinity and the loss of a proper appreciation of the heroic masculine virtues has led to chaos and disaster. Because no true father, by which I mean the sorts of fatherhood that priests are supposed to give up having children in order to embark upon. No spiritual leader with integrity would stand by and watch children being abused and cover it up. This is something that gay people do because they think what they do is wrong, so they're happy to cover for somebody else who's doing something wrong too. A father, a real father, doesn't sit idly by while children are being abused. He takes steps to stop it, and he punishes the people who have done wrong. Okay, that's the righteous indignation and outrage of a true father, and that appreciation of it's right and proper to hate the hateful, and we should be outraged about it.
Well, and you said that's part of what you've learned over the last couple of years.
Right, but that heroic manly virtue is something that has been sort of systematically wiped out of the Catholic Church, just like it's been wiped out of other places in public life. Yeah, it's gone from journalism, it's gone from the academy. And it's had results that everybody knows about in all those different arenas. So it was interesting to me writing the book, finding that most of the problems, most of the things that are happening in the Catholic Church, most of the problems the Church has got itself into, basically boil down to there being no men. It's all women and gays. And the vast majority of the child abuse scandal and all of the other things that are wrong with the Catholic Church are a product of the church losing its connection to masculinity and simply having no men left in it.
Well, good. There's nothing controversial about any of that, so that's quite a relief. So,
we don't have to be imperiling.
See, that was a joke. Just so you know that I can actually pull one off. Okay, so I want to return to something, if you don't mind. I want you to tell me what you think the consequences of what happened to you when you were 14 might have been.
Okay, I don't know.
Can you guess? I mean, look, if you're not like,
I'm not unwilling to discuss it with you.
Yep.
I'm not having a problem being forthcoming.
Yep.
I just don't know. The only thing that I've really thought about is whether or not it might have affected the trajectory of my sexuality. And I think that it may well have done, but I don't think it on its own was enough to make a difference. And I think I'm probably right about that.
You also talked about, just in this conversation, about the transgressive nature of that sexuality. And now you've participated in that, even, let's say, as an active participant. And the question is, what did that do to you? What did the knowledge of that do to you because you had to live with it? I don't know if it's a fair question. I don't know if I'm phrasing it.
No, you're phrasing it fine. I just don't know the answer to it. In the same way that I don't think anybody can know what quote unquote made them gay. You know, it's like everybody is born with. I think everybody is born with a more or less of a predilection, whether or not you believe in epigenetics or whatever. Some people do, some people don't. But I think everybody probably has a sort of predisposition, and coupled with early experiences, you end up either mostly having sex with men or not, right? I don't think that we're ever conscious of the processes acting on us at the time, and therefore it's very difficult. It's just pure speculation based on whatever we happen to remember, trying to work out what it was that made the difference. And I don't think it's something that could ever satisfactorily be answered, simply because we're just not aware of the processes acting on us. I don't know if my dad not saving me from, that household made me, made some kind of misfire, rewired, I sent something haywire in my brain. I don't know whether I resented and just like my mother so much that I went off all women. I don't know, and I don't think there's ever any way to know. And for the same reason, I don't think there's any way that I could possibly answer, and I don't think anybody could beyond blind speculation. And I think that most people who try to explain, I'm so sorry, somebody's mowing the lawn. Most people who try to explain what abuse might have done to somebody, in almost every case, I see their political prejudices and their biases at work, out there in search of justification.
Right.
Because the truth is, I have no goddamn idea, and neither does anybody else. No one can possibly have a clue, because these things are acting below the conscious level on us in a way that we cannot dissect and analyze.
Okay. All right. So let me ask you then. Let me switch topics. So, you've been less in the public eye since this scandal.
I've been retired.
You've been retired. Okay.
I've been retired.
Okay. You've been retired. But you published your book.
Look, I sold 250,000 books. I made millions of dollars. I have more nice stuff than I know what to do with. I have a husband I am deeply in love with. I could die happy tomorrow. I helped to get a president in office. I'm one of the 7 people that put Trump in office. And that's not egotism, that's fact, right? I'm one of the 7 people that put Donald Trump in office. I can die happy. Now,
there might be a year or 2 in purgatory for you as a consequence.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe, what happens after I die for that particular crime, who knows? But but the fact is, I have accomplished more than the vast majority of people walking this earth. I have, and if I were to do nothing else professionally now, I would be infinitely more successful than all of my critics combined.
Okay, so
I'm good.
So there's rumors of your current state. There's rumors that you're terribly indebted. There's rumors.
No. Okay, so sometimes one of the problems with trying to find out what's true about me is I like to troll journalists, and I confirm or deny according to my whimsy. So when somebody writes to me saying, "Is it true you're $2 million in debt?" I'll say, "No, darling, it's $4 million." What I won't go to the trouble of explaining is that of my many companies, the one that was funded by the Mercers, who withdrew their political investments from Steve Bannon and from me at the same time, that particular vehicle is somewhat in debt. But I'm not in debt. I don't have any personal liability whatsoever. The sum total of the money I owe is about $977 to Capital One, because I can't get any better credit cards than that because I haven't been in this country for long enough.
I see.
So
it's a corporate problem rather than...
I might not have as much money as I had 2 years ago. I don't. But I'm not $2 million in debt. One of my companies is, and we'll probably have to either try to fight... It will have to fight its way out of that, or it will have to, go through some kind of insolvency process or whatever. But I'm not in debt. I just never bothered to correct the record. And frankly, if a journalist wrote to me, I'm so sorry about the noise. If a journalist wrote to me and said, "Are you $2 million in debt?" and I made the very important, critical distinction between me and the business,
yes,
they wouldn't write that up anyway. They would take my confirmation of the figure as confirmation that I'm in debt and just write what they wanted to anyway. So I feel it's not a crime to lie to journalists, and I feel no obligation to act as their fact-checking result.
I think it's actually a crime to tell the truth to journalists, isn't it?
Amen. No, if somebody comes
treated
to me
like a crime often.
If somebody comes to me to ask for comment, I think it's a moral obligation to fuck with them. Which is why I got myself into trouble that time before, when someone shot up the newsroom wherever it was, because I made some flippant comment about vigilante death squads and journalists or something, and I didn't post it publicly. I wasn't inciting people to hurt journalists. I wrote it privately to somebody who then published it and wrote a story about it, and then they used that as evidence that I was ginning up people, whatever. These are some of the consequences of being the kind of person who can't bite their lip and can't hold their tongue.
Right.
So my job is to create a career in which that doesn't matter. Because I'm not, because my success, my income, my fan base, my profile, whatever, isn't reliant on the prestige economy, but it's also not reliant on the sort of rules of journalistic propriety or whatever. So this is why the reason I'm in Oklahoma is I'm closing the last tranche of money to do a late night chat show. Like Johnny Carson. This is the thing I alluded to earlier in the conversation.
I see. So that's part of your future plans. And who are you doing that with, if you don't mind me asking? Or are you still in the process of waiting to announce that?
I haven't announced anything yet. So I'm getting the money in the bank first, and then I'll do all my hires, and then I'll, announce partners and all the rest of it. But the idea of it is what I should always have been doing, which is somewhere between Bill Maher and Johnny Carson. I can do my characters. I can do my Ilhan Omar, my Dr. Christine kind of characters as cold opens like SNL, except they'll actually be funny. I can do monologues. I can do interviews, all the rest of it. And I'm a live act. I'm not one of these people that can just babble for 3 hours a day like, some of the podcasters can do, some of the YouTubers can do. I just find it so boring, I don't want to just babble for 3 hours. No one wants to hear the same opinions from the same four conservatives on the news every day. It's just mind-numbingly dull. That's not me. I'm a writer and a live act, right? That's where I live. That's my happy place. So it'll just be once a week.
And so how are you going to protect yourself, just out of curiosity, about being censored and taken out?
Because I'm going to make it absolutely anti-fragile. We're not going to be on social media. We are going to encourage viewers not to share clips. We're going to beg people not to put us on social media. We're going to host the video on our own player, on our own website.
I see.
If you want to watch it, put your email address in, and we can sell into the email list, right? So we can, do newsletters with offers and all the rest of it if we want to monetize.
Right. So it's something approximating a private subscription service.
Yes, it isn't completely dissimilar from Alex Jones's model, just without the homegrown products.
Right. Well, that's what we're hoping to allow people to do with this platform that we've been building as an alternative to Patreon. On a broader scale.
Well, maybe I'll be on that because if you'll have me, because this is the only thing I'm not banned from, perhaps. I think these hermetically sealed little universes are the future for us. Look, social media isn't for us. The people who run these companies hate us. They are dedicated to our annihilation. They want to see us wiped off the face of the planet. There's no point handing distribution over to people who hate. And why would you drive up the market value of these companies by providing them free content? Just leave. And I'm always the person who has to do it 2 years before everybody else. So this is what I'm going to do. just leave social media. I'm going to spend a bunch of money converting my Facebook fans into a big, powerful email list, and I'm just going to leave. There will be life after social media, trust me. Once upon a time, people didn't imagine that there would be, that MySpace wouldn't still be here. There was AOL, GeoCities, blah, blah. The world moves on. And in 5 years, no one will have a Twitter account. And you'll be wondering what on earth you were panicking about. And the people who didn't look ahead will be lost. I will have a 3 million strong email list that I write to every day with, a hilarious daily column, and they'll tune in on Friday nights to watch my show, and I'll be perfectly happy. Mm-hmm. Nobody can take that away from me. Mm-hmm. If we get email providers.
What's the timeline for that? When are you expecting to roll that out approximately?
I've kind of pretty much sort of semi-told people already, so the cat's kind of sort of out of the bag, so I haven't really broken the news now, but once the money's in the bank, then I'll say, then it'll be 6 to 8 weeks before we have a set built, so 2 months before we drop. I'm going to have a very open gestation process. I'm going to show pictures of the set while it's being built and all the rest of it. We're not going to do like grand announcements because I've done enough of those in my career. So we'll just have a very iterative period of assembling everything. And then in about 2 months, I will drop episode 1, and it will be the funniest, most hilarious, unmissable hour of television that's somehow not on TV. Produced by anybody in the country. And it will be unmissable and hysterical. It will teach you something, because we'll have a serious component too, whether it's a mini documentary or an interview or a review of something. And it'll be bookended by just the funniest political satire and characters and nonsense that nobody can do but me. And it's sort of what I always should have done. It's what I've always wanted to do. And now I have the breathing space, if you like, while no one's looking, while no one's expecting daily this, that, the other from me. I'm in my, in my first retirement period. Well, like Cher, I will come out of retirement many times in my life. This is, I've had this nice space where no one's been kind of down my neck to deliver anything.
Have you enjoyed that? Like, has there been anything advantageous to you about the fact that you've been sort of pulled away from the public spotlight?
It's been wonderful. It's been wonderful. I've been able to dedicate 2 years of my life to getting to know the man I'm going to spend the rest of my life with, And now we can go about. Now I'll throw myself back into the fight. He's got his own career and all the rest of it, but we've had something that most married couples don't get, which is 2 years just together at the beginning of our life together. Most people don't have that luxury. Or anything even close to it. They immediately get bogged down in the everyday hell of, who's taking the kids to school, did you pay the gas bill crap, right? We didn't have any of that. We just had 2 years of bliss together. And now we have an unshakable foundation. And if I'm away for 6 months, I'm away for 6 months. And it won't make a difference to us because we don't have the same sort of vulnerabilities that a lot of newlywed couples do, because we had that time together. So to my mind, it was time well spent. I've also been reading a lot, and we didn't get to talk about anything really substantive in this conversation except my obscure psychiatric history. But you will see that I've been reading a lot and sharpening my claws and refilling my toolkit. And so when I do start re-entering the arena and popping up on live streams and doing interviews and things like that, you'll see that I've spent 2 years reading everything I can get my hands on, and I'm considerably more formidable than I was 2 years ago, and I was already quite formidable.
Anything you'd particularly recommend?
Not at the moment. I'm going to keep my powder dry because I have lots of fun things that I want to do with it all. But no, I've been regrouping and plotting and sharpening.
Oh, I can't imagine that you.
And sharpening my knives. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be, you don't want to be the first one in front of my blades. No, it's. People keep expecting me to be sad or to have had some kind of terrible experience, and the truth is, I just haven't. I've had the best 2 years of my life. I've been in perfect bliss with the best man I've ever met, and now I'm ready to get back to work.
All right. Well, look, that sounds like a good place to end, from as far as I'm concerned.
That was a nice natural conclusion, wasn't it? That was nice.
Natural conclusion.
Perhaps we could do this again and talk about something substantive instead of my dreadful history.
Yeah, well, you're an interesting character, and so it was substantive as far as I was concerned, and I think people will find it that too. So
well, I hope they enjoy
what happened to you was very singular and unexpected.
It's important that people realize that the specifics of what was said are neither here nor there. It was the fact that the powers that be linked up and decided to defenestrate this person. And because conservatives allowed it to happen, they lost one of their greatest champions. And I'm going to be very successful with very profitable enterprises and perfectly happy just being funny for a living. Because I sort of think to myself, why would I keep killing myself for people why would I keep killing myself for people who don't deserve me? So to some degree, the politics stuff, it's never going to be gone, but it is going to be dialed down considerably. And I'm going to be talking about love, sex, death, and money instead of, Trump or whatever.
Yeah, well, maybe you spent enough time talking about politics.
It's not very interesting after a while, and the people who are in politics are awful. I mean, if those of us who are kind of moving into that political sphere and who have, aspirations toward being elected officials, all the rest of it, they're becoming awful people. I mean, everyone in politics is dreadful, ghastly. I don't think I want to spend 30 years talking about or thinking about those people. I think I want to do something more fun. So yeah, not to say that there won't be characters from the political world popping up in my sketches, but or indeed that I won't do. Of course, I'm going to do journalism. It just won't necessarily be political journalism per se. So perhaps I'll do a 20-minute mini documentary in the show where I'll go out into the country somewhere, or I'll go to Sweden, or I'll go to London, or whatever. But as far as the sort of, the conservative movement stuff goes, the conservative base are cowards, and they are ungrateful, and they are indolent. And I gave a lot and paid my dues and helped get a president in office, and now it's time to do what I want to do, which is make people laugh, because that's a power that I have that nobody else in our world does. So I'm going to focus on that.
Yeah, it's a hell of a power. Rogan can make people laugh,
I think he makes heterosexual men, a certain kind of heterosexual man, laugh.
Well, that's something, There are certain kinds of heterosexual men.
I like the guy, but I don't personally find him, rib-ticklingly funny. But then that's because I like people like Joan Rivers and
right.
That kind of universe. So Bill Burr or whatever. So he's maybe not my kind of comedian anyway.
Could be.
But anyway, this has been fun. So thanks.
Hey, look, I've been looking forward to talking to you for a long time. Oh, and say hi to Vox for me.
I will. He's very much looking forward to me speaking to you too. That's what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about things like the forward, because there's interesting, substantive things to do that you've managed.
Well, look, we'll have another.
Managed, and I know this was your strategy.
We'll have another conversation.
Well, we will, and this is your strategy through this conversation, which is not lost on me, was to make sure that we don't spend too much time talking about you. And you have been successful in that strategy because I've allowed you to. But the next conversation, we will talk about you, because I do want to talk about the forward, and I do want to talk about some of the things that the thing I asked you about on Australian TV and whatever, because I think that
well, turnabout is fair play, as they say.
Right.
And I did apologize to you on
that's it. And
I did make a mistake at the Aspen
and I accept the apology, and thank you for that. No, I think there's important substance to be spoken about, as regards important things. God and knows what else. So let's talk about real things next time.
Well, I think when I'm feeling particularly up to a battle, I'll think about.
And I'm sure a lot of people will watch this. So this is officially the last time I will ever speak about bloody February 2017. So if anybody wants to know anything, you can watch this video, and that's it.
All right. Good. Well, best of luck with your new endeavor.
Cheers. Best of luck to you. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I guess the first thing I'd like to just ask you is how you're doing.
I'm doing great.
So what's great? What's great about what you're doing? What's so good about your life?
Well, right now I'm in the process of putting together my next stand-up comedy special. So I'm at the process now where I've actually put together a full new hour of material since my Netflix special, which came out in October. So that's great for me. That's always a relaxing moment because it's very difficult to put that hour together. And so
how do you go about doing that?
A lot of writing, a lot of performing, a lot of reading, a lot of going over notes, a lot of examining material, a lot of reviewing sets and trying to find out what I like and what I don't like. It's a long and brutal process. It's the most fun, but also the most difficult part of stand-up is the creation of new material.
So how many hours do you think you put in of work to do an hour's worth of stand-up? Any idea?
That's a really good question. It's usually about, I can create a solid 10 minutes a month. That's usually what it is. So it takes me 6 months to do an hour. And in that 6 months, on an average week, I'll do 8 or 9 sets. So that's 8 or 9, either half hour or hours of material, sometimes 15 minutes, usually an hour, depending upon where I'm working and how many other people are on the show. And then a lot of time writing.
So you're doing those sets in front of live audiences all the time?
Yes. Yeah, you have to. That's the weird thing about stand-up comedy. It seems to be that it's not something that you can do in a vacuum. It has to actually be done. It has to come alive in front of the audience. Like I can write in a vacuum. I can write alone. I can contemplate, go over my material, review, edit. I can do all sorts of things by myself, but it really doesn't come alive until it's in front of an audience.
Yeah, well, I guess it's not so easy to figure out what's funny. You kind of hope that people will laugh.
Yeah, it's that, but it's also there's a state of mind that you only really achieve when you're performing in front of an audience. And you can try to recreate it, but it'll be fake. If you try to do it on your own, like I don't write in joke form. Like I don't write the way I say it on stage. I write in sort of a conceptual form. I write in an essay form, and then I sort of extract things that I think are funny out of that. But they really only find the true way I'm going to do them. I only find that in front of an audience, because it's like when I'm in front of an audience, then it becomes clear to me how I should and shouldn't say things based in part on how they're reacting and based in part on how I feel when I'm performing the idea. Like I find where the fat of the bit is, and that's where you kind of appreciate economy of words, and you know what to edit out and what to elaborate on, what people aren't totally understanding, and what maybe is over-explained, and all that stuff kind of comes together in front of an audience.
So the essays that you're writing or the writing that you're doing, like, are they on serious topics? Are they on things you're thinking about philosophically? Or are you trying specifically to be funny, or are you just trying to get some thoughts down, about the way you're thinking about the world?
Both. It's like the ideas, I would say the stand-up comedy, at least the way I do it, it comes in 3 forms. Like there's 3 steps. In the beginning, you're really just trying to get laughs. You're just fighting for survival out there. You're scared. That's in the early days of your career. Then you start doing what you think is funny, like things that would make you laugh. But then in stage 3, you start trying to make ideas funny. And you try to cleverly introduce ideas into people's heads that maybe they wouldn't entertain without the humor aspect of it. And so when if I write on a subject, whatever the subject might be, I write without thinking, I have to make each word funny, or I have to make each sentence funny. I write just what are my thoughts on this subject. And then along the way, I find irony and I find ridiculous perceptions and all the things that lead to stand-up comedy material.
Right,
and I extract those.
Right, and how much of the humor and the wit just occurs to you spontaneously on the stage?
Sometimes a lot. It depends on the subject, but it's always a possibility. Some of the best lines that I've ever come up with in my act come up with on the spot while I'm just talking about things.
Right. Well, that should be when you're like into the subject and things are going well with the audience.
Yeah. That's basically how it goes. It's a tricky business.
Yeah, it sounds like an extremely tricky business, and one where the cost of failure is humiliation and emotional pain.
Yeah, it's the worst.
yeah. There's not that many things that are more embarrassing than like trying to be funny, especially if you've put, say, 100 hours into 1 hour of preparation, which is less than you're doing, and then finding out that you're just not that amusing. That doesn't
more
sound
common
good.
than not.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
It's not good.
So how many Netflix specials have you done now?
I've done 3, and I'm working on my 4th one right now. But overall, I've done 9 different hours of comedy, either a comedy album or a video special.
Yeah. What's it been like working for Netflix?
It's great. They're very easy.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
good.
they really don't have any notes. They just let me. Fortunately, I got to them at a stage in my career where I was already advanced and I was already a headliner, and I'd already been doing stand-up comedy for decades. So it was good in that sense that I was well prepared. But they when we first signed this initial deal, they were really just wanting me to do what I do best.
Right.
So they liked it, and it's easy. There's really relatively little input, almost none.
Right. So they're not willing to mess with success fundamentally.
Yeah, they like what I do, so they're just like, go ahead.
Right.
And they know that my goal is to do my best. I'm not trying to. I mean, there are comedians that will release material just for the money. They'll try to capitalize on their fame and put something out that's sloppy. And I feel like, for me at least, that's not an option, and that would taint my legacy and taint my body of work. I'm not interested in doing that. Right. Yeah. Well, I've seen your Netflix specials, and they're pretty damn funny. Thank you.
That little skit you did on the Kardashians, that was a killer, man.
Thank you. That took forever to work out. I had to figure out a way to make fun of that guy. Or girl.
God, it was ridiculous. You make an extremely intense, demonic gargoyle, a very good sense of humor. Yeah, so that was killing me. I thought, Jesus, he's not going to go there, is he? Oh yeah, he's going to go farther. Yeah, it's good. It's good to see that kind of like horrific courage manifest itself on stage. You really like that in a comedian, when you see them get going. And I used to see this with Sarah Silverman. You could see her eyes sort of flash, and she'd think, "Oh, I shouldn't say that. No, there's no way anyone should say that." Then she'd say it. You'd think, "Oh, no one should have said that." But man, it was deadly.
Yeah, I think out of all the women doing comedy right now, she's probably the best at that.
She can come up with
pushing that envelope.
Yeah, that's for sure. There's some very dark recesses in that woman's mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Netflix thing is going well. Do you enjoy doing that?
Yes. I enjoy it.
What do you like about it?
The danger of it, the difficulty, the challenge that one, it's done and people enjoy it, that I'm legitimately affecting people. I love that they'll get a chance to sit down and watch it for an hour, and it'll make them feel better. They'll laugh. It takes them out of the dreary dullness of their day or the agony of whatever they're going through in their life, and they can escape that for an hour. And
thank God for comedy, man. It's just in the same domain as music for necessity.
Yeah, I agree. It affects people.
There are campuses now where there's like no sarcasm rules, eh?
Oh, that's hilarious.
God, can you imagine? I'd last about 15 seconds.
Yeah, is sarcasm considered a microaggression? Is that what it is?
Definitely. Yeah. Unless it's real sarcasm, in which case it's a macroaggression.
I just keep thinking that in time, this is going to be one of the most hysterical periods of time that people look back on, periods of history. Like, when we look at guys with powdered wigs and, preposterous behavior from the past, and we go, God, what were they thinking? I really think we're going to do the same thing about today. I think
I hope so.
One of the most I think for sure.
I hope so. That means that we'll be more sane when we're looking back, or at least we'll be insane in a different way. And I'm pretty much ready for a different form of insane, personally.
Well, I think the insane that you're getting is it's so pronounced and it's so much more intense that it's less effective. And then the reaction to it is more popular. The negative reaction to a lot of this insane rhetoric and this insane behavior, it's more popular now to understand how ridiculous some of these people are. You know, when you see like what Antifa's doing in Portland, blocking traffic and, you know, telling people where to go and what to do, and then beating people up that don't comply and saying that you're a white supremacist if you don't listen to them. And like all this stuff is so ridiculous. It's so over the top. And they keep feeding on themselves. They keep attacking people that are not progressive enough. They keep literally eating their own. And from the outside, from the perspective of people that don't share their ideology, it looks more and more ridiculous. And that makes them more and more frenzied, and it ramps it all up. And I think it's ultimately going to crash. It's just like, what kind of damage is it going to do to the landscape as it's crashing?
Right. Well, that's the thing that, you know, hopefully can be mitigated so that the landing isn't too hard. Yeah. So I thought, look, every time we've talked a lot about me. And like, I'm quite sick of talking about me, actually, and probably have been for like a year or maybe even longer. So I thought that it would be really good to talk about you. And I'm curious about you because you're such a strange character. And so, you know, in the most interesting of ways. And so I thought I'd like start at the beginning. So I don't know that much about you. So where'd you grow up?
Well, I grew up in a lot of places. I was born in New Jersey. I lived there until I was 7. My mother split up from my dad and married my stepdad. We moved to California. We lived in San Francisco from age 7 to 11. Then I lived in Florida. He was going to the University of Florida at Gainesville. Lived there from age 11 to right around 13. Then we moved to Boston, and I lived in Boston for the next 10 years. And that's really where I grew up. I grew up basically, when I think of where I come from, I think of Boston. It's also the place where I started doing stand-up comedy, which means a lot to me. It's also where I started fighting. It's where I started doing martial arts. All the significant things that happened in my life happened in Boston in my developmental period.
And so you moved to Boston when you were how old?
13.
13, I see.
Yeah.
Right. And then you were there for how many years?
11 years.
Oh, yeah, so that's a long time. Yeah. Where do you live in Boston?
Newton, Upper Falls. It's a suburb of Boston.
Yeah. Nice in New England, eh?
Yeah, I love it out there.
Yeah, me too.
The people have a great sense of humor. It's like Toronto in a way that you have to deal with that wicked winter. And I think that develops character in people.
It was funny. You know, when I moved to Boston, because I lived in Alberta and then Montreal. And Montreal is bloody horrible in the winter, and Alberta's even worse. And so I'd go down to Boston, and I went down there to interview first, and it was February, and like it was spring as far as I was concerned. I didn't even have a coat on. And then when we lived there for years, you know, it was so funny. We lived in this old house by a park, and we get those nor'easters blow in, you know, with the hurricane level winds, and it bloody well snowed 3.5 feet. And I'd be thinking in my Canadian way that, Jesus, I better not go outside because I'll just freeze to death the second I step outside. But I'd go outside and it was like, well, it was 34 degrees or some damn thing. It's like I was expecting minus 40, you know, just horrible. So Boston winters never, I mean, apart from the snow, which was, you know, deadly significant, they never really struck me as winter. They sort of struck me as, well, this is the sort of winter that you'd like to have if you wanted like a showy winter that people could be pleased with, rather than one that just sort of killed you.
Yeah, Canadians are on another level when it comes to winter. I have some pretty good friends that live in Alberta, and whenever I go up there, it's like, whoa.
Yeah. Where do you go?
They're outside of Edmonton. They're about 2.5 hours north of Edmonton.
Where?
I don't know the name of their town. It's where I go bear hunting. That's
yeah, because bear, one thing you notice about bear is they have fur. See, that's why they can live there. Human beings, they don't have fur. So they actually can't live there. Yeah, 2.5 hours north of Edmonton in the winter. Yeah. You go outside.
Rugged.
You go outside in the wrong day and you're out there too long, then you die. So
or you run into a grizzly, which is also
yes. There's also that. Those are nothing to contend. Those are nothing to take lightly, man. When we used to go camping, especially in British Columbia, grizzly bears were always a concern because, like a black bear, if it chases you, and first of all, it's only about a third the size of a grizzly bear, and it's still pretty big. Like it's a black bear, it's not like a house cat. And if those things chase you and you play dead, they'll usually leave you alone. But if grizzly chases you and you play dead, then it eats you. And then of course, if you fight back, well, it also eats you. It just, maybe you get a blow or two in, and probably not. So, yeah, that was one of the terrors of camping there.
More people are preyed upon by black bears. When a black bear attacks you, it's usually because it's trying to eat you. When a grizzly bear attacks people, it's usually either a mistake or it was scared, or it's really hungry.
Yeah, the black bears tend to be like that too. A lot of them are old if they attack you.
Yeah.
They're getting so they can't catch a real animal, so they'll settle for like an Arctic monkey with no fat. So